I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Teresa. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I am joined with my friend, fellow scholar, author, and Substack extraordinaire, Jose Miguel. How are you doing, brother?
Doing well. Looking forward to tackling 4,000 years worth of history.
I know, right? If you haven't already noticed in today's stream title, Jose and I are taking the incredibly audacious task of encapsulating 4,000 years of Chinese history, dynastic rise and falls, changing political structures, societal changes, philosophy, history, religion, into somewhere around 3 hours today. At least if we can do that, we'll consider it a job well done. So, yeah, last week was everything you needed to know about the American cowboy. And after last week's stream, when we were backstage, so when we finished the stream, Jose and I can still talk to each other. I was like, well, what are we going to do next week? And we threw around a few ideas, and I said, well, how good are you on Chinese history? Because we always bring up China. Almost every conversation we have, China comes up. He's like, well, enough that by next week we can do something on it. And I was like, all right.
So here's the goal. And what I know is whatever we go over, succeed in going over in this time frame, I know I'll have forgotten more about Chinese history than what we've covered.
Yes.
So.
And for anyone out there, we are not attempting to provide you expertise on any one particular dynasty, right? I had a professor that I took classes under, and in fact, these were some of the textbooks I got from him: Chinese religion and an anthology of sources, Chinese religions, and he was a specialist just on oracle bones. Oracle bones are going to occupy about that much of today's stream with the written, basically the written Chinese script first appearing, which had to do with divination and spell casting, all this different stuff. Anyways, that was his expertise. So you could spend a whole lifetime on just a sliver of the entirety of topics that we're going to be touching on today. You know, some people spend their whole academic career just focusing on the Sui dynasty, or as we'll be talking, I'll be making my claim, the Tang dynasty being one of my favorites, often referred to as the golden era of Chinese history. And we are trying to not only just hit you on the high spots of each dynasty, but take you from basically 4,000 years of history all the way up to the present day CCP. So we'll see how it goes. How was your prep for today's stream?
It was good. I decided to take more of a technical angle and monetary angle because most people don't cover that. So I'm hoping that it'll balance out with you bringing the dates and the significant battles, etc.
Right. Yeah, that's how we're going to be approaching today's stream is and that's one of the reasons why I love tackling these topics with you is we have so many shared interests, but the way we approach the information is different. And therefore he has so much knowledge that he's going to present today that probably I'm not aware of, and potentially vice versa. But the way that I structured the general format of today's stream is I have about 8 characteristics that if I were to tell someone about Chinese history who doesn't know anything, and that's what the assumption today is for the audience is we're assuming you guys don't know anything. And to lay out basically 8 characteristics that are really indicative to understand Chinese history, because we're going to be seeing a sort of historical continuity of a 2,000-year dynastic lineage. Now, that's going to change. Foreign people are going to come occupy and rule the Han, rule the dominant Chinese population, and they're going to get it back. And we'll see that collapse, and then the rise of the Republic, and then the Civil War that leads eventually to the Maoist winning and modern day China existing in the way that it is. But through today's conversation, where you're going to see why why was there a difference between the Southern Chinese and the Northern Chinese? Because you're going to find that when we get to the modern period, or anybody familiar with the Civil War, it's the nationalists, it's Sun Yat-sen, it's Chiang Kai-shek in the South, eventually flee to Taiwan. That's where you get Cantonese versus Mandarin Chinese. Well, those divisions between North and South, we'll see really about 2,000 years ago get cemented with the Northern invasions and all the aristocracy and the manufacturing and the textiles. All that stuff moves to the South, which is when I studied in China. I studied at Sun Yat-sen University. It's Zhongshan Dashui in Chinese, and it's in Guangzhou. Guangzhou's probably the third, maybe the third or the fourth largest city in China. You have Beijing, Shanghai being the first, then Beijing. And Guangzhou is the first place in which Western medicine arrived in China. It's the southern ports, and the river that Guangzhou is on takes you straight to Hong Kong, right? So the way you come into southern China is they sail through the ports there in Hong Kong and into the river system that takes you into mainland southern China. And that's where so many of these factories, when we think about textiles and manufacturing, this is not new to the 21st century. China has been playing this role for a very, very long time. This is kind of their bread and butter. And one of the reasons why you see so much of that commerce and that manufacturing in the South has to do with events that occurred thousands of years ago and that actually divided different cultures. And when you go to Guangzhou, you still hear people speak Cantonese, even though Mandarin is the official language, and Cantonese is a remnant to this cultural divide between the Northern and the Southern Chinese. So we're going to be touching on all this different stuff today, and it should. That's why I titled it "How China Became China," is because if you learn some of this history, modern China will make so much more sense.
The great irony is, even when it comes to technology, their approach to technology and development makes a lot more sense when if you look into their prehistory. So
Right.
into the rise of the first dynasty, the Shia dynasty,
Yep.
which I guess that's a good place to start.
Yeah. So before we start going through the chronological timeline, and I want you to sort of riff off any of these points that I put forth, is I was trying to think before you dive into, at least for me, this is the way I think about a topic. Before you dive into the chronology and some of the specifics, it's interesting to know, like, what are the characteristics of the thing you're about to study. And the first one regarding Chinese history is that it is an extraordinary civilizational continuity, much more so than other civilizations. So we're talking about written language, classic literature, philosophy, religion, or spirituality. Again, that's a debated topic even today in religious studies, how you classify Taoism and Confucianism. But religion, philosophy, political concepts, we're going to see the rise of legalism, and we're going to see three competing schools or ideologies during the Warring Period, this point in which China solidifies itself, develops this idea of itself as an empire, solidifies a written language, and then begins to break apart. And you get people like Confucius and Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. And what you see here is the rise of three specific schools. Confucianism, which is focused on right relationships, political. It's really focused on order and how they believed order was tied with personal virtue and morality, something that is quite orthodox in a way, that the way that you live your life as an individual and the way that you engage with people, especially in a social hierarchy, develops an order that allows these empires. And that's what Confucius was responding to. He's wondering, why are these things falling apart around me? Well, they have these emperors that are engaging in debauchery, orgies, drugs, whatever it may be, decadency, you can put it. And all of a sudden their empires fall apart. These dynasties fall apart. This is what Confucius is responding to. And so Confucianism has the ideal or the anthropology that man is actually innately good. Then you have legalism that is a response to Confucianism and is actually developed by a student of Confucius that says people are innately bad. And the way that you then fix people is through the strict mandates of political and social laws and regulations that must be centralized and enforced. And then you have Taoism, which is about going with the way, this sort of cosmic flow, this cosmic energy, the yin and yang symbolism. I have whole streams going into Taoism, and I would recommend anyone reading Christ the Eternal Tao, which is taking aspects of the Tao Te Ching, replacing Tao with logos, and showing this similar metaphysical understanding. So you have these three schools. And so my point is, this continuity is going to color everything: ancestral veneration, ritual traditions, Confucian ethical categories, bureaucratic government, right? China is one of the first places that, in a sense, perfect the bureaucracy as opposed to the aristocracy. A continuity of historical memory and an idea of a unified realm that it's called Tianming, the mandate of heaven, from once they believe that they are the center of the earth. And if you look at China in Chinese is um, um, Zhongguo, and Zhong is middle earth, essentially. They believe that they are the middle kingdom. They occupy the place between the upper and lower realms. Um, so, anyways, the first one you have to understand is that this is a unique historical continuity, and a continuity that isn't found in all other places. Do you have any comments on that, Jose?
Sorry, say that one more time.
That the first characteristic is the extraordinary civilizational continuity when you're looking at Chinese history.
No, very true. It's fascinating. I mean, of course, Confucianism cements this down the line as things develop on, but the filial piety doesn't just apply like within the family. It applies with the relationship with the central state, with the emperor, the crown, the son of heaven, as well as with essentially all those who've come before. So when you have as you said before, people debate: does it fall under religion? Does it fall under spiritual practice? But the veneration of one's ancestors, that's so heavily cemented, or was heavily cemented, at least up until Mao Zedong, of one's forebears, it helps give it a level of continuity that no one else in the world has ever managed to match.
Right. Yeah. And then the second characteristic I wanted to point out is the recurring ideal of political reunification. So I would say the number one pattern, and you're going to see it because I actually have a video that is more of a map of the history of China. There's no words or anything, but when we move through the different dynasties, you'll see how China is breaking apart and reunifying itself. Is that Chinese history is all about unification, fragmentation, reunification, fragmentation, reunification. And this is why Confucianism and Taoism and legalism are so important, because you'll always see a return back to these core Chinese values whenever fragmentation occurs. And typically you'll see it being point to the morality or the virtues of the people themselves or the leader. And this gets tied with it because they believe in Tian Xia is the emperor as the son of heaven. Tian is just heaven in Chinese. And the idea is that the virtues of the emperor and the man who's supposed to lead, because the emperor truly is uniting the heavenly realm with the earthly realm. This is how they cosmologically understood their kingdom. So the point being is that these features, this unification and then fragmentation and reunification, this reestablishing their mandate under heaven, this returning back to these core Chinese values will happen over and over and over again as you move through their dynastic rise and falls.
And interestingly, there's a film, I think it was like 2002 or 2003, called Hero. It's a Chinese film about the concept that at this point, 4,000-year-old concept of all under heaven. And what does that mean? What does that signify? And it does also display how different the Chinese mind is from the Western mind when it comes to service to one's emperor. So anyway, that is a recommended film from my perspective.
Yeah, I have not watched that though. I need to check that out. And then a third characteristic, well, we've already kind of mentioned it, we'll collapse it in two, is this mandate of heaven, this Tian Ming, this idea that, as I said, the ruler who becomes tyrannical, corrupt, incompetent, incapable of maintaining social harmony is responsible for things that typically follow: war, rebellion, famine, things like that. The fourth characteristic is that the state becomes bureaucratic rather than aristocratic. This is one of the delineations between Chinese history and European history. And you'll see this, especially with the legalism and some of the reforms we'll see in the different dynasties, that at points it will move towards sort of aristocracy. You'll see, for example, the beginning of the Han Dynasty sort of give land to the family members, but then there's always this return, especially because the virtues of Confucianism are very meritocratic, that you're going to get this emphasis on not, and it's really right from the beginning of Chinese history, is after kind of the mythical hero, Yu the Great. We don't know if he's real or not, but he's kind of the foundation of Chinese mythology regarding who they are. He's the great foundational emperor. And we'll get into a little bit more of his story when we start going through the chronology. But right after him, the question, just like we saw with the Umayyads and we saw with the Visigoths in Spain, is how does your succession process work? Is it a bloodline? Is it a familial lineage, or is it a meritocratic voting, or bringing in someone who everyone has the confidence in that they can accomplish the task? Which method do you choose? And we'll see that from the onset, they end up going with the bloodline, but then throughout history, you'll see that they end up going with a more meritocratic option of who, and it really colors what you'll see even in the Gaokao. The Gaokao is the famous standardized exam. I remember when I was in China, for example, there were students that, as I said, I was at the part that is Chinese as a foreign language. So it's Chinese students who know English teaching Chinese to foreign people, sometimes in Spanish, depending on where they're from. Most people were speaking English no matter what country they came from. Anyway, if you ask one of those students, why did you choose this as your major, or why are you a master's student in teaching Chinese? And they'll tell you, well, it was one of the options I had based on my exam. What they're talking about is a 2,000-year period of a standardized exam called the Gaokao, and it has different names throughout history, but essentially the imperial structure would put out, and this had to do with Confucianism and rules and philosophy back in the day. How you scored on that exam determined on what level of opportunities would be presented to you. And that's still true today in China to a degree. So when you go to university in China, depending on how you score on the Gaokao, depends on what majors you can choose. You can't just choose any, you can't choose to be a civil engineer and score poorly on math. They won't even allow you. They'll give you options. And that's when we talk to the students that taught Chinese as a foreign language, it was kind of like sociology, some humanities, some opportunities they might have because they scored poorly in different areas on the Gaokao. So that is right there. That standardized test that still exists today in China is ancient. That's been part of their tradition on how they cipher through their population and find exceptional people. So that was my number four. Do you have anything to say about the bureaucratic versus the aristocratic structure of China versus Europe?
Well, we'll definitely see that come up in the this second dynasty. I believe it was the Zhou and the Shang. That's where you get because there was a point early on where the Chinese were very similar to Europe in regards to things being very aristocratic based, very strong vassals. But then as the centralized state got stronger and stronger, it was through meritocracy. And I know the one, it's not really it doesn't really exist as a competitive group anymore, or hasn't for for more than 1,000 years. But I know it's the Mohis really doubled down hard on meritocracy. And that's why Confucianism effectively absorbed the aspects of Mohism that were fruitful and useful.
Right. And that's the score of legalism, as I mentioned before, the Mohis that Jose is referring to.
So yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no problem.
Okay.
So do we want to jump to the Shia dynasty and the beginnings?
Yeah. And just two more characteristics here. Chinese religion, because that was a huge point for me in regards to studying Chinese history, is like, are they religious? It's really a perennial question. Is it philosophy? Is it spirituality? Is it religion? My only point is, as we move through here, I'm going to make specific dates, important dates as we move through the timeline. But Chinese religion really develops through an accumulation more than a replacement. This is what would differentiate it really from Christian Europe or Muslim, the Islamic Middle East or Arabia, is there isn't a rise of a specific tradition that is a forced conversion or unifies a variety of different people under one banner. That's not really what happens in China, and there's never has been that. So that is a unique feature when you look at some of the other civilizations, is that their religious or spiritual orientation is truly evolving through centuries of ancestral worship. You get as Jose mentioned, the Shang royal cult, where this is where we'll see the Chinese script emerge on like turtle shells and oracle bones and stuff like that, into Confucianism, Taoism, and then eventually you get Buddhism. And Chinese Buddhism is a totally different flavor than, Mahayana Buddhism you'd find in Thailand or something like that. So they develop, all of this stuff comes together. And religion then today, when we think of China, a lot of people think of Buddhism, but Buddhism is really the only foreign religion that really took root in China. Everything else is pretty indigenous. And so I wanted to place that in perspective, that Chinese religion is evolving throughout the centuries, and that Chinese history is really a relationship with its north, which is very interesting. So as we go through these dynasties, you're going to see the place in which China is most vulnerable is on its northern border. And this is where we'll see, and it's a different, we can call them the Mongols, but there are different Turkish groups throughout history. And the earliest one that we'll get into right now when we get into the timeline is the Xiongnu. It's a type of Turkish. They're almost like the precursors to the Huns. And they actually end up making some success, but with the rise of the Han, they're able to officially defeat these people and expand the imperial court and Chinese dynastic rule. And but that they're going to come back. So there's always these ebbs and flows, and eventually they will be conquered by the Mongols. And another thing, the last point, and then we'll get into the master timeline here, is China throughout history has always been one of the largest economies on earth. So that is not that's not a unique feature. So you'll see them being a manufacturing hub. Obviously, the Silk Road is going to be a major point of emphasis in today's conversation. And China invented things before the West. You know, one of the big things is they got out of the Bronze Age before the Europeans did. So once you're in the Zhou dynasty, they moved from bronze to iron 100 more years before Europe even begins to use iron. So you'll see some of these technological features of China that make it very interesting. When we get to the Tang dynasty, it was arguably one of the strongest, if not the strongest, empire of the Middle Ages at that time. And so we're talking between the 600s and the 900s. And obviously, this is during the time of Byzantium. This is on the heels of Justinian the Great and some of the expansions of the Byzantine Roman Empire. And this is also during the rise of Islam. So keep all that in mind. That's what I love about history, is thinking about all these other things going on at the exact same time. So anyways, do you have anything to add for that? If not, we can dive into a master timeline and begin talking about some stuff.
No, in terms of one, I guess the only principle I would add on top would be one thing that stands out in Chinese technological history is the idea of mandated open source. So long before you had the Free Software Foundation or the birth of open source in America and the West, going back into prehistory, the concept of open source did not only exist in China, but it was mandated by the legendary Emperor Yu. And as you look at technological development over those 4,000 years, the concept of monopolizing an idea or a technological idea was wholly unheard of, and it was very much in the culture seen as a duty to share one's discoveries and to have good ideas spread as fast and as far as possible. So that's something that I'll be bringing up as a recurring theme as we go through. But also in terms of governance, well, you had the thing that defines China is the centralization of power in the person of the emperor. There's also a lot of localism at the same time. So it is very much a both and situation where you have a very strong central power, while at the same time, for your typical peasant, the local culture, the local language is what affected you and what mattered.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to show you, let me bring up a timeline, and feel free, you can start wherever you want to start. I have my mostly dates and specific things regarding the historic timeline, but and maybe before we do, just so we don't get distracted, major thank you to the Bombasticus. Throws in 10 says, will you talk about the conspiracies of the Great Wall, hidden pyramids, and pre-flood structures in China? Also, how these Chinese supposedly take credit for ancient structures they didn't build. So I've been to the Great Wall. I've been on the Great Wall. I'm familiar with hidden pyramids. In fact, if you go to the Terracotta Warriors, which I have a point of bringing up today, one of the things that was recently discovered when I was there, I was at the Terracotta Warriors in the summer of 2012, and they just discovered that this massive mound to the, I forget which direction, I believe it was the southwest of the Terracotta Warriors, was actually the place in which the famous emperor was buried. And so they had this underground, again, it looked like a massive pyramid. It looked like a hill, but they claimed it was actually a pyramid that housed the emperor that wanted to be buried with his Terracotta Warriors. So in regards to the conspiracy theories about the Great Wall, I'm curious what Jose thinks. Have you heard the idea that it was to keep the Chinese in and rather to keep the Northerners out? What are your thoughts about that?
I have not. That's new to me.
Oh, okay.
So that's not a topic that I know.
Well, it is a conspiracy theory out there. I've been on the Great Wall, and at points, so they argue that the wall faces inwards, which would make sense that if it was built by other people and not the Chinese. However, the reason why I'm skeptical of that conspiracy theory is having been to China, in their museums, they have documents, multiple documents from different dynasties adding to the construction of the Great Wall. So unless those are forgeries, uh, I'm of the position that the Chinese did in fact build the Great Wall in its different sections. It was never built by one dynasty, it was built by a collection over centuries. So that's my personal opinion, but I'm still open to other stuff. Bombasticus, if you want to clarify which ancient structures they didn't build, feel free to send that in later.
And the core of the wall was rammed earth. So rammed earth is a very simple building technique. I mean, even sub-Saharan Africans, a lot of the buildings that they built were rammed earth. So it's not like the wall isn't. I mean, it is tremendous in the terms of the size of how big it got and how much they got of it. They got done, but in terms of technique, it's not super complicated.
Yeah. All right, so here's a little overview of the timeline. So this is what we're going to try to walk you guys through today. Is there's the pre-dynastic China, which we know a little bit about, and there's a mythology about Yu the Great that we'll explain. And this leads into the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty. And we're going to walk all the way through these, and maybe not we'll focus so much on Northern versus Southern Song, but we'll just, at least the way I structure is just the Song dynasty in general. And we'll walk our way all the way to modern China. So where do you want to begin, Jose?
Well, I guess we can begin with the legendary Emperor Yao and how he assigned Yu's father Gun to address the issue of the crazy amount of flooding that they had
Yes.
In the plains, especially around the Yangtze and the Yellow River.
Yep.
So this is a flood myth that is distinct from the world flood myth, which a lot of peoples around the world, a lot of ancient peoples have. In this case, it's just continuous flooding from the rivers. The Yangtze and the Yellow River are horrific in terms of their flood patterns. They're extremely unfriendly to human life. And this plays a significant role in terms of why China is the way it is. So in the case of Yu's father, Gun, when he tried for 9 years to essentially get the floods under control, and his approach was through building dams as well as dikes. Very similar to how the United States, interestingly enough, does flood control today. Or like, for example, like you see with the levees of New Orleans, for example, to help protect it from hurricanes. So that technique did not work over those 9 years, and Gun ends up getting executed, not by Emperor Yao, but by Emperor Yao's successor, Emperor Shun. So after Emperor Shun executes Gun for his failure, he puts Yu in charge, and Yu's job, instead of taking the approach that his father did, he decided to take the approach of, all right, how do I conform to what nature has already built? So his method was essentially, all right, I'm going to dredge and channel instead of just trying to dam and block and contain and just have buffers for where water goes. So instead of building walls, he had his workforce deepen and widen existing riverbeds, which is crazy to think about, digging new channels to guide floodwater through controlled paths to get it out to the sea. So his core functional idea was the water has to go somewhere, so I'm going to give it a route to get so it can get to where it's trying to go. And the most famous engineering set piece in the legend of it is Mount Longmen, which is also referred to as in English as Yu's Gateway. Longmen, I believe it translates to Dragon Gate. I'm open to being corrected on that because I don't actually speak Chinese. So Yu was said to physically cut a channel through the mountain itself so that the river could pass freely through. So this engineering through solid rock, 4,000, supposedly about a little over 4,000 years ago, that is actually, that, believe it or not, that part of the legend is not out of the question in terms of possibility. Eventually, we'll get down to where you have the first unification with, just before the first unification with the Qin. There's a famous Chinese engineer named Li Bing who replicated the same techniques supposedly used by Emperor Yu and successfully managed to do the exact same thing. And that we do have written down and documented as the events which or the things that Yu built were all pre-writing. And that's the other significant thing. You have the taming of the Yellow and the Yangtze River through this these methodology of dredging and channeling the waters, the frequent floodwaters. And all this happened before you had a writing system, which is really crazy to think about. So, we usually look at a writing system as something necessary for technological development. And yet this legendary emperor, or man who would become emperor and establish the first dynasty, managed to tame the rivers all before there was a writing system.
Right.
So,
and you the Great becomes essentially an archetype for the emperor and kingship in general in China. So there is a debate within Chinese academic circles about the historicity of Yu the Great on both sides. So you're not wrong or right, depending on if you believe he is a historical figure or if he is um, a mythological archetype within Chinese history, because a lot of what we're going to be getting is actually coming from the Han Dynasty. They write the first systematic history of the Chinese people. And that's where we, as a primary source, we get a lot of our understanding. And the thing about Chinese history is they recorded tons of stuff way before other empires were doing such. Well, we know about storms and great floods and natural disasters and assassinations and stuff because they did have a great um, uh, library, I guess, of documenting imperial transitions and major events. So you the Great, I bring it up. You did a fantastic job of explaining the story. Is looking at him almost symbolically, is you can see Chinese Taoism and Chinese ideology even in their foundational tale. It's not that he stops the water, to Jose's point, like American dams and he channels, he reorders it. And so you becomes an archetype that the emperor, whether you're looking at the emperor through a legalistic lens, the Maoist lens, the Confucian lens, or a Taoist lens, what the emperor does is he establishes order within chaos. And you is able to demonstrate that at a very foundational environmental way that saves civilization and makes them more prosperous, because they were wiping out entire rice fields, entire civilizations whenever the Yangtze and the Yellow River would flood. So my looking at him and as a symbol, he really submits the idea of the ideal emperor in the Chinese imagination.
and the thing is, those rivers were tamed before Chinese civilization had writing, and it's even evident in the archaeology. So someone indeed tamed the rivers, and the significance, it was not just those two, but a total of 9 rivers that were tamed using this dredging process and this channeling process, and that those 9 rivers that were tamed effectively became the first 9 provinces of China. And so that hydraulic engineering project, ironically, is what I would say is the material justification, or rather the material foundation of or part of the material foundation of the emperorship itself. So the fact that you have these massive territory, multiple dialects that are mutually unintelligible, all these people were united together by an emperor for the purposes of taming the rivers, which turns this constant, nearly annual waves of death that would come with flooding into super fruitful and fertile farmland. Right. So that which produced death now constantly produces life, and that enabled a population boom, which is part of why China, going back for 4,000 years, for most of human history, was the center of the world's population. Even today, when you're averaging out the human population, even with the explosion that's happened in Africa, the center is still in East Asia.
Yes. So that puts us at the beginning of the Xia dynasty. So why don't we start with that? Go ahead and open, and then I'll fill in wherever I see fit regarding your discussion.
All right. So I mostly just covered what I wrote up on that was just mainly on you, but the big principle that's there from the beginning that the Xia dynasty is credited for is the idea that once a solution is determined to work at a local level, it is to be spread empire-wide. So there's no concept of hoarding knowledge for the sake of maximizing one's own gain, and there's no concept of licensing either. So it's very much the opposite of the English approach to, or the post-Protestant Reformation English approach to innovation. So when something works in a given area, it gets spread everywhere, and that's something that you supposedly mandated.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I wrote up on the Shia dynasty. So I'll leave it to you to keep going the story past.
Well, I was just going to say that the Shia dynasty, as I said, it sort of it answers the question of where does Chinese civilization begin? And it is kind of in the place between myth, cultural memory, and archaeology, because to Jose's point, we have archaeological evidence. We don't know exactly the day-to-day like we do in some of the later dynasties, even though at that point we know more about some of these Chinese ancient dynasties than we do, aspects of the West. And so people have brought up, is the Shia real? I do believe that the Shia dynasty is legitimate, despite people are more conspiratorial minded that believe that it was, I don't know, a figment of Chinese imagination. I do think that it has historical origins. And to your point, I would say some of the defining features of this dynasty is we see the beginning of elite architecture in China. We see bronze production. We see the earliest examples of roads, which is pretty interesting. Palatial compounds, especially for the more well-to-do in their social status, and we see an increasing social stratification during this point. So I bring all those up because you're seeing China move into real social stratification, a real empire of delineations between groups and peoples, and and I believe that if you look into the archaeology of the Urlitu civilization, I believe that is the Shia dynasty. That was one of my points. So I do believe in the historicity of the Shia dynasty, although some people have questioned that. So, and notice this transition here. So what do you think about the Shia dynasty? We see water, primordial water in a way. You could take it as a mythological chaos turned into order, turned into life, turned into prosperity. We see a sacred ruler in Yu the Great, and we see the emergence of a civilization and the beginning of a dynastic lineage that's going to last 2,000 years. So with that, now we get into the dynasty we know way more about in regards to history, and that'd be the Shang dynasty. And so just to give dates, the Shia dynasty, we're talking 21 BC to 1600 BC. And then 1600 to 1050, so roughly about 550 years, we're going to get the Shang dynasty. And go ahead, you can share what you wanted to say first.
Yeah, no, just in terms of scale, one way to compare these various dynasties over time, I set up was a comparison of the scale of their militaries, because that's something that you don't see large. Well, of course, Rome has its legions, but at least after the fall of Rome in the modern West, you didn't get a big standing army, or considered a big standing army, until the King of France in like the 15th century, where he had a standing army of about 32,000 men. So I just wanted to compare that as a benchmark, France in 1450 versus each of the dynasties. So the Shang dynasty, of course, in terms of numbers, had the smallest standing armed forces. And interestingly, in terms of deployments that we have records of, the Oracle Bones, as mentioned before, usually record deployments of troops for conflicts between 300 to 1,000. However, with 3,000 happening on occasion, and in one case, the single largest mobilization that happened during that nearly 600 years, 13,000 men. Interestingly enough, those 13,000 men were deployed underneath the emperor's consort Fu Hua, which is the first example of a female general. I don't remember how they did, but that's the idea of the scale. At this point, this is the smallest scale of all the dynasties in terms of its size, power, etc., and it just grows. It just gets way crazy from there. So if you want to estimate the relative power of the Shang dynasty in terms of size relative to the medieval king of France, it's about the third the size, and every other dynasty is just going to dwarf the most powerful medieval kingdom. So
And these are the oracle bones he was mentioning. So one of the important things about the Shang Dynasty is this is the first time we see an explicit Chinese script that is being used by these different groups that if they were to verbally speak to each other, they would be incomprehensible. This is the unique thing about the Chinese written script is that it actually unified people that when speaking, they actually couldn't understand even though they're using the same written language. And so and this was one of the reasons why this part of the story, the Chinese story, is more well documented. But we see what we're looking at right now is divinization inscriptions on turtle shells, animal scapula, bones. And a lot of it had to do with a very magical and sort of theurgic understanding of their relationship with nature. A lot of these had to do with rainfall, fertility, harvest, military campaigns, childbirth, sometimes believed to be prophetic dreams, ancestral displeasure, and ritual sacrifices. And so that was going to be my point about the Shang dynasty, and much of my focus is coming at it as a religious studies scholar, is that this is the first Bronze Age civilization, let me put it as a royal civilization in Chinese history. And we see the development of the king standing upon aristocratic lineages, military elites, dependent communities, regional allies, and their religion is really where we get this emphasis on ancestral worship. So if you go to China, still today, people are always lighting incense for their ancestors. Now, is this a religious act? Is it a cultural act? This is actually debated at other points in Chinese history, especially when Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit, is in China because he sees these incense burnings of ancestors, and they explain it to him through a Confucius lens, and he asked, "Is this a religious act or is this a civil act?" Well, it's really hard to tell, but this idea of ancestral worship, we at least have historical documentation, really gets going during the Shang dynastic period, and they believe that their ancestors can do a variety of things, which is very interesting. They can bless, they can punish, they can influence harvest, they can affect pregnancies, they can cause illness, they can influence the weather. And we see the development of a sort of deification of war heroes, great generals of this time. And they develop this concept of the great Lord of Heaven, or the Lord on high. Shangdi it's referred to. And so Shangdi then develops as a religious concept that from their ancestral worship, there must be an ultimate ancestor of authority. You can say this is a concept of God on high. Many people have made that point. And so then we see veneration back to Shangdi about influencing weather and warfare and harvest and stuff like that. So we see ritual communication during this period. We see the more ancestral folk religion that China, Taoism, Confucianism is going to emerge out of. All this stuff is essentially getting established. Language, ancestral worship, the emphasis on the king and his relationship to the archetype of Yu the Great, being the great emperor moving forward. So I would say the big takeaways from the Shang dynasty, let me go back to my timeline here. The big takeaways from the Shang dynasty, I would say, is writing, is we see the written script established. We see full-blown Bronze Age civilization. We see divinization. We see ancestral worship, and we begin to see royal sacrifices, which at times did include human sacrifice at that point. But we see all these things get established during this period. So essentially, we're seeing religion, language, culture really being established that's going to color the rest of Chinese history.
And one thing I wanted to definitely follow up on with that too, two things. So one is short. So the proto-currency that they were using at the time were cowrie shells. So just small little shells, which people would use as a means of store of value exchange, means of exchange. The other part with the Shang is, it is the Shang, is agriculture. So this is where we see the earliest markers of what would become the future of Chinese agriculture.
Yes.
So we have documented roots of pond-based fish culture, even within the palaces of the emperor, where they would have fish ponds, which were grown primarily for food, and they would they would actually actively fish as also a form of recreation to catch the fish that would later be cooked. You have a phrase for fishing in the garden, which apparently was a thing for the royal fishing, the practice of royal fishing. Yeah, so it's very common that this raising fish, the domestication of fish, arose in this era, and this would color all the future agriculture, which we'll get down to in the following dynasties. But yeah, so that's something I want to point out because it's the very beginnings of aquaculture. And I'm a huge fan of aquaculture, so that's why I know a bit about it.
And so we're going to be playing this video here as we move through. And so we just transitioned to the end of the Shang period. So this is 1046, again, roughly 1050. The dates can be murky depending on what source you're looking at. So don't pay too much attention to that general approximation here. So we see the Shang dynasty falls to what becomes the Zhou dynasty. And that's going to be split into these two, the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou. So we look back over here, we can see the Western Zhou. And just like if we go back to the Shang, you can see what Jose mentioned earlier, how small that is, right? This is the smallest dynastic period in Chinese history. And this is sort of the beginning. So then we get to, let me move back. Here we go. 1046 here. So now we move to the Zhou dynasty, and we're looking at essentially the period between 1046 to 256 BC. So a much more successful, almost an 800-year period. And this is where we see the Tianming become established. This is the mandate of heaven, the idea that China is truly the center of the world, and that the emperor of China is the man that unifies the heaven and earth. And so the Western Zhou, face a legitimacy problem. This is what leads to their fall. So the Shang had ruled for centuries, and overthrowing the established king was justified by the fact that the Shang had become morally corrupt. And it was, and you can actually look in, and forgive me, I do not have all the Chinese emperors memorized. But the last Shang emperor, ruler, king, like will be replayed throughout Chinese history, was getting into orgies, was getting into decadence. And what tended to happen is that he would lose the respect of the people. He would become much more strict on the people while he himself was living a very decadent life. And we're going to see this moving into the Warring period, where Confucius is trying to respond to this problem, this continual problem of these leaders falling into decadency. And so this is what happened with the Shangs, and the Western Zhou emerged from that. And they claimed that heaven had transferred legitimate rule to them from the Shang. So developed for the first time in Chinese history, oh, the mandate of heaven can change to different groups of people based on the behavior of one. And so to me, this is, again, a revolutionary implication. The mandate of heaven creates a remarkable principle. The dynasty can lose its divine legitimacy based on immorality, oppressiveness of the people or the peasantry, and incompetence. So that leads to rebellion, invasion, famine, disaster, social breakdown. Everything that could threaten the dynasties was being perceived through this mandate from heaven, that the emperor is bringing it on the people based on his own actions. And yeah, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, the other thing that stands out about the Zhou, which does not transfer over to any dynasty past the Qin dynasty, is the fact that when you look at the framework of how the Zhou ruled, it was very similar to feudal Europe. Very similar, ironically, to the King of France,
Right.
where you have multiple vassals all over the place. I think this map even actually breaks them down. So you have all these vassals underneath the emperor. So he doesn't have direct control over everything, and can't, for lack of a better term, can't wield his will the same way that future emperors would be able to, because you have to take he had to account for the fact of very powerful aristocrats. And the fact is, this vassal system that they had, similar to what existed in Japan up until the Meiji Restoration, this network of vassals essentially guaranteed fragmentation down the line, similar to what would happen for Japan, 2,500 years later with the Sengoku Jedi Civil War that they had. Essentially, the Zhou dynasty was something that future dynasties would remember as to the importance of why it's important to maintain centralized power in a centralized state. Because, civil wars apparently is a bad thing, and it indicates that you no longer have the mandate of heaven.
Yeah. And to your point, that the feudal system in Chinese was called the Fengjian system. And it is very similar to European feudalism. It had royal relatives, allies, and aristocratic lineages that, if you, again, looking at this map, oh, what happened to it? Looking at this map, you can see that just that little purple center, that's the kingdom of Zhou. That's the imperial court. And then they are ruling all these different fragmented, I guess, principalities, because they would have, in a way, princes. And you can see that that is setting itself up for a very unstable situation where once a faction begins to rebel, the imperial court there, the Jew, are going to have a real tough time responding back to it. And so that is a huge point. And then once you get into 770 through 256, which we're about to see, I'll let this thing move a little bit further, you get the Eastern Zhou. And the Zhou royal court relocates eastward after this political collapse that you're about to see. And it's going to move, and it's this period's divided between what's called the spring and the autumn period. And it leads into the Warring States period. The Warring States is generally 475 to 221 BC. And the spring and autumn period is that they're searching for a way to unify this system. And you can see we're now at 488. It's still not unified. And you can see these power factions grow and strengthen themselves. And this is going to lead to 475, the Warring States period, where they're going to figure out, try to establish who is the dominant power here. And it's going to change Chinese history in regards to the emphasis on centralization. And because they ran the experiment of fragmentation and how it doesn't work. So the spring-autumn period, political power becomes fragmented amongst all these competing states. The question that the philosophers were asking is, why has society fallen into disorder? And how can harmony be restored? Allah, this is the exact same period in the spring and autumn period that you're going to get Confucius. And Confucius sees himself as recovering these older Chinese rituals, ethical system, political formation, emphasis on education, and views the fall of these periods in this autumn and spring period under the Zhou, this Western Zhou and Eastern Zhou period, as falling away from these Chinese traditions. And that society, so he develops these ideas of Ren, humanness, and benevolence. Remember, the Confucians believe that humanity, our anthropology, is innately good. This is in opposition to the legalists, the Maoists, who view us as innately bad. Therefore, we must be regulated by social reform. He develops a concept of Li, ritual propriety, that you must have this continuity with the past. And this is why I think the archetype of Yu the Great and him redirecting the rivers really colors the way that the Chinese mind understands history and time, is that it's flowing, it's water, it colors the ways in which Tai Chi and martial arts will emerge and how they understand the Tao. And so we can see that for Confucius, having a ritual propriety with the past is essential for this continuity. Filial piety, the way that you relate yourself to your father and your mother and your grandfather. Righteousness, personal virtue is emphasized in the concept of Yi. And then Zhenzi, the morally cultivated gentleman, the idea of a well-rounded man of morals, virtue, and integrity that's educated and is competent. He can be used, that he becomes essentially the Confucius moral example. So you get the idea of self, family, community, state, and world. All those things must be ordered, beginning with the self, then the family, then the community, then the state, then the world itself. And so this is what Confucianism is ultimately trying to do.
And I wanted to capture a bit of the scale of how things change in the warring states and spring and autumn periods. So I mentioned before that the United Zhou dynasty never once deployed more than 13,000 troops. So during this conflict, the Duchy of Qin, which is not exactly the biggest one there, deployed a 60,000 man army. And you have armies at this point growing at the scale into the hundreds of thousands, which is literally an order of magnitude more than the King of France in 1450. Before we get to the Qin dynasty and their eventual reunification of everybody, you had this element parallel to Japanese history, which some may be more familiar with, where the emperor was the figurehead and you had the shogun and people were competing over that. The same thing happened with the Zhou. The Zhou king became a figurehead, and you have the rival states fighting amongst each other for real control of state power. As you mentioned, Confucius has his rise. One thing I wanted to build on that is how, so you have this concept in the red pill in the West that women they tie their status to the status of their man. And this is definitely not the case at all in all of written Chinese history. A woman's status was tied to her son's achievements. So it's very interesting. And this is something you'll see as well as in Byzantium, in Rome, in Japan. I did a survey for an article a while ago, and in most all successful civilizations that managed to make it past the 300-year mark, a woman's status is always tied to what her children succeed in doing.
Well, and that even affects Chinese culture today. Remember when they had the one-child policy? It's now a three-child policy, but the Western media was outraged by the infanticide of little girls.
Yep.
And why does that occur? Well, to Jose's point, and you still see this today. I have a friend who married a Chinese woman that he met during our study abroad programs, and her whole goal was to have a son with him. And once she had her son, their marriage fell apart. They got divorced. But my point here is that even for a modern Chinese woman, this idea of having a son, and then, this is where you get the tiger mom archetype and motif, and cultivating an exceptional son is huge because it's rooted in this Chinese cultural understanding of the relationship between the mother and the son.
Very true. And it's interesting because I know she's been trying to work on reversing the population controls of Rockefeller that Mao implemented. And they're discovering it's not as easy to turn things around as many suspected. I know, like, Xi himself would like to remove the cap completely, but he's not the universal. He can't enforce his will universally everywhere throughout the whole apparatus. There's a huge swath of the technocrats, the technocracy, who are very invested in population control. Unfortunately for Xi, as well as for China in general. But yeah, that's something to consider, like how alien modern society is, even from classical and traditional Western societies. The fact that women no longer derive social status from their kids, but rather from who they share a bed with.
Right.
That's part of why our society will not survive. If you look at matriarchies, there's a reason why they don't form civilizations, because women's status ties to how hot of a guy can they bag in a matriarchy. Whereas you look at patriarchal societies, a woman's status is very much tied to the achievements of her sons as well as her daughters. In the case of China, the emphasis was all wrapped up into sons. And this was true mostly for East Asian countries, as like Korea and Japan. Yep. Although Japan, the most successful clan, the Fujiwara, who ended up taking over, essentially controlling the emperor's palace, they were interesting in that they did actually honor women who had successful daughters, and that was part of how they managed to take over the political power within Japan. And it was their descendants, Tokugawa, who would end up forming the Tokugawa shogunate. But yeah, so essentially, women do have a role, and they would value women who managed to get themselves, either they themselves raised children well, or they had a daughter who managed to marry well into the emperor's circles in order to project influence of the family. So such women would be honored for doing so, and for raising up children inside the imperial household who would be loyal to the Fujiwara clan. So that's one thing that Japan got over China in that regard. But the last part on the Confucian thing I want to touch on was the social hierarchy. So number one was scholars. Number two, the second class was farmers. The third was the artisans, those who worked with their hands. Then merchants, and then of course at the very bottom, money lenders. So as a rule, the most valued thing was those who achieved intellectual as well as moral perfection. Emphasis, hence why scholars were number one.
Because I even drew a diagram on my note here.
Yep.
King, nobles, peasants, merchants. Imagine a pyramid, and in the Zhou dynasty, the merchants are the lowest of the low. They're lower than the peasants, even though they may be wealthier.
Yep. And there's a huge emphasis in Confucianism of productivity is always valued over the extractive. And a merchant who merely moves things is not as useful, is not as important to society as the artisan who actually makes things. And the artisan who actually makes things is not as important to society as the one who does the work to feed everyone. And so you have this interesting thing. I know there was a phrase like 7 generations from rice paddy to Mandarin, and then 7 generations from Mandarin to rice paddy. It's about the arc of a family, of an individual family rising through into power within the empire. And interestingly enough, the place where if you want to pursue, you can become wealthy through becoming a merchant, but wealth was not going to buy you power within the emperor, within the emperorship or within the emperor's court. The crazy thing is, a successful farmer had more of a shot of installing his children, grandchildren, great grandchildren into positions of power than that of a merchant.
Yeah. And remember, it's during this period here where before the Qin end up conquering here and having, really, it's a very brief dynastic rule. It's about 15 years. It's very, very transformative because the idea that they're going to fragment is no longer the case. It's about centralization of power. It's about bureaucratic reform. And so it's during this period here, during this warring states period, that you're getting Taoism to emerge in its fullest through Lao Tzu, Guangzi. You get, and again, these ideas of Wu Wei. It's a foundational concept in Taoism about effortless action, not forcing. You can think of Bruce Lee in the 20th century talking about water, be water, flow with water. This is where Taoism begins to develop a spiritual metaphysics and cosmology with these ideas. This is when you get Mencius and Xunzi, the Confucius scholars after Confucius, where Mencius is human nature is fundamentally inclined towards the goodness. It becomes cemented within Confucianism. Xunzi develops that human desires require education and ritual discipline, that to control that innate goodness through education and ritual discipline, that goodness can be directed towards larger affairs. And then, of course, you get the Moist, as Jose mentioned, critical of the elaborate aristocratic structures of before, emphasis on impartial concern from the imperial court, emphasis on meritocracy and merit, frugality, not excessive spending, not decadence, anti-decadent, and practical governance. And you combine that with legalism, and you set the precedent for the arrival of the Qin, because the thing that's going to characterize the Qin dynasty, which I said is basically 15 years, essentially from 221 to 206 BC. And it's that they take this legalism and run with it and create what's called the Qin Revolution. The Qin destroys much of the old hereditary aristocratic political system. It's gone out the window. Instead, it's now divided into administrative units governed by officials appointed by the central government. It may seem insignificant, but it's actually a pretty significant aspect of Chinese history here.
Mm-hmm. Things I wanted to cover too, because I know we're at 249 BC on the image, but we have the first hard records of the game of Go in 2,500 years ago, so about 2,500 BC. And that game actually played a very critical, played a role in educating the field commanders and officer corps for the various militaries. And of course, back then, today, the Go board is 19 by 19. Back then, it was 17 by 17 in terms of the grid. But that is where the game becomes extremely prominent. So the thing about the game of Go, which is interesting, because as you mentioned, you have the split, you have the Taoists, you have the Confucians. I don't know what the Moists had in terms of their opinion of the game, but the Taoists and the Confucians were very suspicious of the game at first. But then as time went on throughout this Warring States period, Go was actually elevated by both as one of the 4 arts. So as you mentioned before, like the properly educated man, he would have mastered the qin or the guqin. It's essentially a 7-stringed instrument, which one would master for private play, and interestingly enough, not for playing for other people. So it's supposed to be for cultivating one's own inner character. And then, of course, the game of Go itself, which is the only art of the 4 classical arts which is built on competition. It was seen as a means of instilling patience and virtues in the children. So not just teaching the importance or teaching the difference between tactics and strategy, as well as what is essentially a prototype of operative art, what the Russians would call operative art. The game was valued in the end by the Confucians and the Taoists because they saw it as an effective means of teaching virtue to children. And being someone who's actually using Go as one of the core pillars of my children's homeschool curricula, I can confirm it definitely instills patience in children. And I mean, granted, it's just my oldest right now who's playing, but how many 6-year-olds have an attention span where they can sit and play a game for 35, 40 minutes, which is mind-boggling to me. Apparently today, that if your child can sit and concentrate like that at 6 years old, they're like 2+ standard deviations or 3 standard deviations above the mean for attention span. That was the norm. That was normal for a 6-year-old 2,500 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and this is one of the oldest games. There's one other game from Egypt that is comparative in age. However, it's not really played outside of Egypt. But yeah, I consider like Go to be, it's such an it's such an amazing game. It's part of the pillar of it's part of our core part of our homeschool curricula, and it's definitely an aspect of Eastern civilization that I see as worthy of what are you calling it? Yeah, I played Go. Oh, okay. There you go. But yeah, it's worthy.
Irish pubs. He lives in Ireland.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's worthy of adoption because it really does instill a lot of core elements of strategy and operations, which the modern officer corps and at least the people determining strategy for NATO have zero grasp of. So this game itself can cement a lot of things intuitively if one plays it from childhood. And so if I have a child who does end up going in the military, a lot of core things in operative art and in operations, strategy, and tactics were all fully absorbed while they were still a child. So the other 2 arts, of course, were calligraphy. So disciplined brushwork. So your calligraphy not just had to communicate what you're trying to communicate to others, but it had to be beautiful and it had to be ordered. Sloppy, hesitant brushwork reflects a sloppy, hesitant mind. And the same thing with painting, which is the 4th art. So those were essentially the arts that a cultured Confucian gentleman had to master, as well as a woman as well, for indicating that she was from a good family.
And I was going to say, during the same period, I had it pulled up there. This is when Sun Tzu writes The Art of War. It's during the Warring States period. So you can see, even though it's a fragmented period of Chinese history, a lot comes out of these Warring States period. We're looking at the game Go. We're looking at the Art of War. You're looking at Lao Tzu, Confucius. A lot of the foundational ideas begin to emerge during this period, leading up to the Qin taking over here.
Mm-hmm.
And right here.
This is also where.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was going to say this is also where you have the first big thing in terms of monetary history for China. So before I mentioned how in the previous dynasty in the Zhou early on, people were using shells. But here's where you see the first appearance of tally sticks in widespread use. So a tally stick is, in the Western tradition, you take a stick, you mark notches in it to indicate the debtor amount, the credit amount, you break it over one's leg. The guy who is the one who's owed money or owed something, whatever good it is, would hold what was called the stock. So he was the stockholder. The one who was owing held the short end of the stick, which was called the foil. So that's where the phrase short end of the stick comes from. That's where stockholder comes from. This was used as money. This was used to mark business ownership. And that's why we call them stocks when we're trading stocks. China had the same thing, except they used bamboo. So the importance of this is that this was the dominant form of money used in most commerce. And this is something that you see throughout all traditional societies. Imperial currency, even in the case of Byzantium with the solidas, or the ruble with the Tsarist Empire, most transactions for peasants, everyday peasants, were done with tally sticks. And tally sticks were essentially the first, and to this day, is the first peer-to-peer currency that operated wholly outside of governance. And we're going to be going through the history of tally sticks as we go through the history of China, because China was the last country in the world to give up the use of tally sticks. And I did want to point out that the game of Go, if you look at the written records compared to the hard archaeological records that place it to at least 2,500 plus years ago, written records say it goes back to 4,300 years, but it wasn't until the Warring States period where it was cemented into, okay, this is now part of the standard education for a child, for a boy or for a girl. And the same thing with tally sticks. Tally sticks go back, as well as in the West, back to the Neolithic period. We have archaeological evidence of this, which is fascinating. Well before writing even existed. So deep into prehistory, tally sticks were a thing. But here they just spread out like crazy, and they functioned for about 3,000 straight years as the means of currency. And in this case, it was very important because you had such a fractured power was so fractured among the vassals, and you have all these various warring states. What is the currency that you can use for day-to-day transaction? What are the currency that you can use for store of value? Tally sticks became the dominant thing.
Well, speaking of money, Gregory throws in 5, says Matt Damon's movie, The Great Wall, keeping the dragons out.
Now I have to see that.
I've seen that either.
Yep.
Pressure just became a Coda Crew member. Shout out to you, brother. Thank you very much for the support. And Detuliosaurus, shout out to our brother Austin Detulio, reminding you all to pay your tithes. And guys, you can ask Jose and I questions as we move through today. So don't feel like this is just a lecture. If there's anything that I or Jose mention and you guys have a legitimate question on, feel free to send it in and we'll try to respond while we go through. And I'll try not to move through a new section so that we can, if you have questions, we can answer them immediately. So keep that in mind. And if you have any questions so far, we're now up to 212 BC. We're at the 15-year period reign of the Qin dynasty. We're getting ready to hit to the Han, a high point in Chinese history. So if you have any questions so far or comments, or you just appreciate the depth of our presentation, feel free to support. You can use Dono Chat or Streamlabs, or help us reach our Dono Chat goal here on stream or on YouTube. Matt Scroggins, Logos Academy member, throws in $10, says, great stream so far. Got some questions for later once you all have finished the presentation. Well, thank you, Matt. We'll look forward to the questions. And okay, so the Qin dynasty, as we said, this is a 15-year period. One of the important points that I want to highlight is look down here on the left of the emperor. Who does it say? It says Qin Shi Huang. You go over here, a very important historical person. So even though the dynasty only lasted 15 years, he invented the title Huangdi and essentially moves it from king to emperor. It's a new honorary title. I've seen one translation that I wrote down is First August Emperor of Qin. And essentially, it's now an imperial monarchy. Traditional kingship now becomes imperial monarchy. And so, as I said, there's the Great Qin Revolution, only 15 years, but it's destroying the aristocracy of before. It's establishing administrative order, meritocracy. We see the official standardization of all writing, all coinage, all weights, measurements, roads, and administrative procedures. So you're seeing the tentacles of the central state begin to standardize and impose uniformity across a multitude of different things. As I said, it very much has a legalistic character, much more so than the Zhou or the Xia dynasties. And so this is where you get the famous tradition of burning books and burying scholars. This does happen under the Qin because they're not putting up with any political contentions with the state. So any competing political doctrines immediately suppressed. So it's not exactly a free speech era at this point. They're taking a new focus. The focus is centralization, bureaucracy, and harsh legal reforms. And so, why did the Qing collapse so quickly? That's a major question. Well, it has to do with enormous labor burdens. So, they're only in power for 15 years, and the amount of labor it took to standardize everything was a huge burden on the empire. Military conscription. During the Warring States period, one of the things I wrote down is that it was customary that if you were a male and you turned 15 years old, you were conscripted into a military. So I thought that was just interesting for modern people to reflect on a 15-year-old immediately becoming a soldier in a military. So military conscription became difficult. Taxation became difficult because one, the people, even though the Qing were stable, the people didn't like it because they were so harsh if anybody violated some of their legal procedures. So palace and tomb construction, major construction projects in this 15-year period. As I said, harsh punishments that made the peasantry not very fond of them. Succession problems, rebellion from Qin Shi Huang's death. Who's going to rule after him? And the Qin dynasty failed, but the Qin political revolution did not fail. It's going to be concretized and fulfilled in the Han dynasty, the one that's going to come next.
I wanted to just quickly take one step back as it relates to how the Qing failed, and also their rise and their failure from a tech standpoint. So there were three. One thing I want to do first was just establish, like, at the end of the Warring States period, where China was in terms of technology compared to Europe in terms of military technology. So one key thing that is a key point of comparison that's easy to understand is the Chinese crossbow. So the Chinese crossbow, even going back to the 6th century BC, so 2,600 years ago, they had bronze cast triggers, like precision bronze cast 3-piece mechanisms that essentially it allowed an archer to hold a fully drawn heavy bow at rest indefinitely. And a super light trigger pull. So, you have your gun guys talking about their 4-pound, 3-pound, 2-pound trigger pulls. The Chinese during the Warring States period had the same ideal where they were trying to get as light of a trigger pull as possible to maximize accuracy on the crossbow. The Europeans would not develop anything similar to it until 1,500 years later, which is crazy to think about. There's also a huge deal because the Chinese armies at the time were very heavy on crossbows. Like, I know by the time they get to the Han Dynasty, it'd be about 50% of their army would be crossbowmen. At this point in the Warring States period into the Qin Dynasty, it would be about 30% of their troops. And what's crazy is these the cast trigger mechanisms for the bronze triggers had interchangeable parts. So they were standardized and had interchangeable parts long before Europe ever had that, which is just crazy to think about. And the fact that they set up casts to have standardized parts is just absolutely mind-blowing. Yeah, so eventually the Europeans would make a better form of crossbow with the use of pulleys, etc., and screw mechanisms, because Europe went through its own medieval warfare period.
Crossbow.
Say again?
Especially the English crossbow.
Yep. Oh, the longbow.
Yeah,
the longbow. Yeah, which was that's a whole separate topic. The other thing I want to cover is agriculture. So this is where we had the pond cultures that the Zhou dynasty had, where you had the beginning of aquaculture. During the Warring States period, towards the end, you get around 460 BC is where we have the solidification of true closed circuit aquaculture. So it was the I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but Sangji Yu Tang, which was the Mulberry Dyke fish pond system. So the Taihu Lake Basin is the best example where this was done. But communities built ponds originally for their fields, and they constructed water conservancy stuff, works, etc. And on these dikes that they built, they would dredge up stuff, build up dikes to contain the floodwaters that would be coming through. And on those dikes, they planted mulberry trees, which of course fed silkworms. So inside the depressed areas that they just dug out, they would then plant rice in particular, and inside that they would raise fish, in particular carp. And that comes up important because tongue, I think, is a word used for a specific kind of carp. The kind of carp they had domesticated at that point would swim among the rice, essentially eating pests, insects, as well as weeds. And of course, the silkworms silkworms shed their outer skin, or whatever it's called, a ton. So that would be another food source for the fish, as well as their waste products, which would fertilize the rice fields, or the rice paddies, as well as vegetables. So there's a fellow named Fan Li who's a statesman turned farmer, because being a statesman in power and then becoming a farmer was not seen as a negative move in terms of one's status in society. Fan Li wrote the world's earliest fish farming manual, and it was raised on raising common carp. And that became the standard reference for the subject for 2,000 years. So his book persisted absurdly long. The only people I know whose works have persisted about as long as his, you'd have to go to the works of Homer. But yeah, so it wasn't just digging a hole at fish. So the beginnings of China's well-developed irrigation and canal engineering came in here. So they had lowlands in general that were continuously waterlogged. So they excavate the wet ground, as mentioned before, piling them into raised rectangular dikes. That's where they plant the trees. And they would also plant crops up there too. So from the process of the fish, also their fish waste is providing a fertilizer during the different times of year based on the water levels. You would also grow lots of vegetables. So and the crazy thing is that this was such an efficient system. It could be done by a peasant family on 1 acre and grow enough food to feed the whole family, as well as enough silk to clothe the whole family, as well as sell some extra to cover your tax burden. So it's just, to me, it's impressive because it's the first fully closed loop aquaculture system that produced a complete, not just a fully closed aquaculture system, but it produced a complete animal protein with the fish, which are fully edible. Of course, your prime energy source was rice, which was growing in there as well. And of course, vegetables, a variety of different vegetables and fruits for all the other nutrients that a growing peasant family would need. So the whole cycle, in terms of how it works, to summarize it, is you have mulberry trees growing on the dike. Their leaves feed the silkworm. The silkworm, in turn, their waste, as well as their molted skins, which would produce, apparently 1 hectare of mulberry would produce about 18,000 kilograms of molted skin. So that's a ton of molted skin. That all becomes fish food. And then the fish, of course, also act as a pesticide and herbicide, removing the plants that you don't want, stealing nutrients from the rice and the vegetables, as well as removing insects that try to get at them. And then also used, and also, of course, the molded skins themselves would also function as fertilizer for the mulberry trees too. And let's see, yes. So their whole entire goal for your typical peasant family was to maximize the total pond output of whatever little bit of land that they had. And so every winter, the nutrient-rich mud that's settled on the pond bottom gets dug back up, spread on the dikes as fertilizer, and also to grow more vegetables, feed the fruit trees, etc. And then once the flooded stuff comes back in, rice is replanted, and you get rice for the next year. And as we're going through the various dynasties, I'm going to point out different revolutions that result in essentially population booms. Because when you increase, Malthus did correctly observe that when the food surplus happens, population naturally increases. This is part of what propelled the Qin dynasty to be able to conquer everybody, because this closed loop aquaculture took off in their backyard. It generated a whole lot more food, especially among the subsistence farming peasant class, which results in a whole lot more manpower, which one can feed for one's armies, which enables one to conquer and unite all of China. And of course, this also was the beginnings of the silk industry, where you have essentially every single peasant family producing silk as part of this closed loop cycle. Silk eventually, as mentioned before, the Silk Road, when it becomes a thing, this will lay down the groundwork for the silk industry that would rise and also generate wealth for China as a whole.
Well, it's totally apropos because the Silk Road gets going with the next dynasty.
Yep, which we'll get to. One other thing I wanted to point out too was the Mohis. So while the Mohis, yes. Patrick knows more about the Mohis in terms of what they stood for in terms of their religious views. What I focused on was on their impact on engineering and siege warfare. Uh-huh. So, they had their 10 core doctrines, the Triad Essays, which I find an interesting name. But the key that survived, even past where Mohism was no longer really a thing that anyone followed, was their engineering works and their engineering manuals and siegecraft manuals. So one episode I want to pick is the famous episode. It was the Gongshu dialogue. So the aggressor, he had the state of Chu, ruler, of course, the king of Chu. He was persuaded by his chief siege engineer, Gongshu Ban, also known as Lu Ban, who is later, just as Patrick mentioned before, many of these generals, etc., would be venerated kind of how we venerate saints today, or how the Greeks would venerate Achilles and Odysseus, and the Romans too. Although they didn't venerate Odysseus, the Romans hate Odysseus. Well, they didn't hate him, but they'd look down upon him compared to the other heroes of the Trojan War. But Lu Ban convinced his king, hey, we can totally take out the state of Chu. No, we can take out who's their
Chu
neighbor? Yes, yeah. So that was the one who went to war. So Lu Ban worked for the king of Chu. He convinced them to invade their bordering state of Song. So the little one right there, just to the north. So the Mohis, the Mozi himself, actually went to Chu specifically to head this off. So he challenged Deng Shuban to a war game, a tabletop war game. So much for Father Moses' idea that tabletop war gaming is for losers. But challenged him to a war game, playing out how the siege would function. And after multiple war games, Mozi won every single time. And then at the end, in his defense of Song, at the end, he revealed to both the king of Chu and his chief siege engineer that 300 of his disciples were already on Song's walls and had already equipped it with defensive devices. And Chu called off the invasion. So just an example of how drilled in wargaming was in the Chinese strategic thought, as well as the importance of engineering, and how even though that this school of thought died out in terms of its philosophical religious aspects, its contributions to engineering became the standard for mechanical engineering in China going forward throughout its history. One thing I want to point out is the first type of trebuchet arises in this period. You have the traction trebuchet. So that was pulled up by up to 100 people. The traction trebuchet was the king of trebuchets until a version of it made its way over to medieval Europe. It evolved into the mangonel, which evolved further into the counterweight trebuchet, which is what we usually associate with the trebuchet. Eventually, when the Mongols conquered China, they actually used European counterweight trebuchets, which the Chinese immediately recognized as a massive improvement over their traditional traction trebuchets. So it's just interesting how a technology invented by the Chinese made its way over to the Byzantine Empire, and then was improved upon by the Europeans twice. And then this twofold evolution of it ended up coming back to China because of the Mongol conquests. And then, of course, the later Mohis cannons. So towards the end of the Warring States, you had the later Mohis cannons, which essentially is considered proto-scientific by modern scholars, but it goes through the details of mechanics, of levers, pulleys, structural load, optics, geometry, calculating heights, distances, and depths, all the things used in standard fortification design. So while Mohism fell out of favor after Qin unification, and especially with the Han making Confucian orthodoxy under the Han era, right. The technical chapters of all the Mohis works were preserved and copied a long after, and their impacts were felt throughout wars for the rest of the Chinese history of China. And what's interesting too is, so as you mentioned, Confucius focused on relationships. The Mohis largely drew from that artisan class, which makes sense given engineers. Most at that time, engineering and a tradesman were essentially the same thing. You didn't have this split between theory and practice, it was essentially, in a sense, one could actually see Mohism as an attempt to challenge the Confucian hierarchy of artisans and engineers, saying, "Hey, no, we're actually just as important as the farmer, and the scholar." So anyway, Qin Dynasty. Oh, right, lead up to the Qin Dynasty. So this is, again, so you have this agricultural revolution happening with closed loop agriculture in the backyard of the man who would become the Qin emperor. Here we have I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but you have the Dujiangyang irrigation system, which happened just before the unification in 256 BC. So this actually is very important in modern day China in the past 5 years, which we'll get to when we get to the modern day portion. But the state of Qin, he commanded the Qin ruler commanded the governor Li Bing with his sons to build this irrigation flood control system on the Min River near modern day Chengdu, and it was funded by the king Zhaoxiang of Qin specifically to strengthen their western breadbasket ahead of the unification wars. So the Qin did intend this conquest of everybody was planned, and they recognized, it's actually interesting enough, it relates back to Sun Tzu's Art of War, where he gives a command of, don't send your armies out beyond where you can supply them. He wanted to conquer all of China. He had to be able to supply his armies to march across all of China. And to do that, he had to get the breadbasket thing going. And you already had this agricultural revolution among the peasantry happening with this closed agricultural loop. And so this giant, massive engineering project was just to make the entire Min River flourish like crazy, just like what you did for the Yellow and the Yangtze and 7 other rivers.
Yep.
So the big portions, the 3 portions of this project, you have the fish mouth levee. I'm just going to use the English translations, but it's a bamboo cage and cobblestone diversion dike shaped like a fish's mouth. So it splits the Min River into an outer river, which retains most of the natural flow, and then an inner river, which was diverted toward the Chengdu Plain for irrigation. Then you have the flying sand weir, which was a 200-meter wide spillway connecting the inner and outer channel. And its sole job was to use the natural swirling flow of the water to discharge excess floodwater and silt and sediment from the inner channel into the outer one before said silt could build up and create a dam, a natural dam. So there was no need for sluice gates, which is what the Europeans would use in their tech 1,500 years later. So it was a way of using nature to keep things naturally, not so you wouldn't have to keep dredging things over and over again. And this still functions to today. Then you have the bottleneck channel, which was a channel which was cut through solid rock, just like Emperor Yu. And this is why there is serious weight to the legend of Emperor Yu being a historical character. The way that Li, what was his name again? Li Bing cut through essentially a mountainside was the same guide don't block philosophy that Yu used. And so what he did was essentially he split this way through solid rock using a fire, then essentially heating and then cooling, rapid heating, rapid cooling method. So he used hot fires to build up and superheat the rock, and then dump super cold water on it to cool it down rapidly to fissure and break up the rock. And that's how so the thing is, the Qin era tools at the time couldn't reliably cut through bedrock. So they got through the bedrock using this fire and rapid cooling water method. And that controlled the final volume of water that would flow into the Chengdu plain. So it's a direct engineering echo of the principles of Emperor Yu. And it does lend credence to the idea that even though they didn't have tools that could cut through bedrock, they had the principles of, in this case, thermodynamics and material science to be able to break through bedrock using heat. And the reason this matters is even today, 2,280 years later, that system still functioning, and it irrigates over 1,000 square kilometers, which is still used for China's breadbasket, which is important in terms of China's current strategy towards food security. And I think also is that's anyway. Now I'm ready to go to the Qing Dynasty. As you mentioned, the small seal script was developed at this time.
Well, I want to say one thing about the Qing Dynasty before we move to the Han is. Again, getting back to Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. Now, we talked about these previous dynasties, but he developed the Huangdi understanding, the new category of the soul. Again, remember that they're all focused on the centralization of power and that he is the first representative of this. Only a 15-year period, but this is where you get the terracotta warriors. So I just wanted to mention this because it is pretty cool. I've been there. It was a very long bus ride to get out there. One of my favorite cities is Xi'an, and we'll get to that, especially with the Tang. It becomes the Chinese capital city. But going to the Terracotta Warriors, this was the mountain or hill that I was talking about. You pull up and park in the parking lot, and this is what you're facing. And it kind of looks like a pyramid or a hill or something like that. Well, when I was there, they had just done I don't know what the exact scientific method they were using, but basically the sonar, and they had proven that there were vessels, there were would appear to be a burial ground in the middle of this thing, verifying the tradition that this is where Qin Shi Huang was buried. I asked, is anybody going to go in there? And they said, no, there's no plans by the Chinese government to actually dig it up or go inside. And one, they said, is probably very, very dangerous because there may be tons of mercury or various poisons or things inside there, because the whole point in Chinese culture is to never open it up again because it's in the underworld. It's in it's beyond the veil here. So the Chinese government, because I asked, because if you're a curious Westerner, you're like, oh my gosh, well, I wonder what's in there. Well, they speculated tons of gold, And remember, we talked about all these administrative reforms and the enormous labor burdens that were facing the Qin. Well, this is one example of these labor burdens, is that they develop the new status of the Chinese emperor, and then he has this elaborate burial made for him. These terracotta warriors, I've walked along here. There's like 3 of these hangars that they've built over where they've excavated the terracotta warriors. And what's crazy is they're not all the exact same. You know, you look at them from here and you think, oh, they're just like, maybe a handful of molds, and they just keep doing it. They're actually not. That's one of the mysteries about the labor and undertaking it took for people to build all this. I saw one reading or article I was reading was like speculated maybe 700,000 people it took to build the entire burial mound and the terracotta warriors, and then they just buried it in the ground. And the horses are depicting real horses. The soldiers. Now, I asked when I was there, is like every single terracotta warrior a soldier? They said probably not, but they were handmade. And so every one of them is actually unique, which is crazy because there's hundreds, thousands of these. And you think, my God, why was this emperor? You can understand why the Qin fell apart. It's like, why is this emperor spending that much human capital, that much resources to build all this? Because he wanted to take it all with him. And so he thought that by making these replicas, and here's the thing, this was what is even crazy about these terracotta warriors, is that some of their swords, if they were too dented or they were unclean, they would actually replace them with new ones. So they're not just investing in the time to make these terracotta warriors, they're actually giving them real weapons. And if they were too blemished, they would give them new ones to be buried. So it's like massive material human investment into this happening. And this is what causes the succession crisis of the Qin, because who's going to rule after him? So this gets you, this is what their armor looked like at that time. So again, we're talking 212, 220 something BC, pretty interesting. And anyways, I just wanted to make that point because it's such an interesting part of history that, this is what it looks like. I have in fact been there.
Man.
It's pretty cool. Basically, if you're not a history buff, you'd probably find it boring because you just go and you walk around this stuff. But if you love history, it's pretty cool to see because it's amazing that somebody took that much effort to do all this. I don't know why it's not loading, but forget it. But anyway, so that was the last thing that I had to say about the Qin before we get into the Han.
I got one more on the Qing quick. It's coinage, because this is where you first see the standardized currency from the States. Yeah. So round coin, square hole, standard weights, standard measures. And what's interesting is, so coinage was used for paying your taxes. It was used for large scale trade between the crown and, large, like, your equivalent of like large landowners, etc. Most transactions, though, were still being done with tally sticks at the local level. So it was the norm for peasants, for farmers as well. Anyone who wasn't like super wealthy, you would actually only engage in trade to get enough coinage to meet your tax obligations. And outside of that, you'd have your own local tally stick system, which would be cleared at a local clearinghouse at the end. And they would do them in essentially market fairs every year. So it's just something I find to be very fascinating, because most people today, we use, as even with like these super chats, USD, US dollars, the idea that most transactions through most of history were not handled with government currency is just something utterly foreign to the modern mind, even to the point where even people who propose, like, for example, the most diehard Bitcoin proponents I hear, or even read, like the people who wrote Thank God for Bitcoin, they write a history of money, and they don't include tally sticks, which is why actually one of the serious errors within that book, and why I see it as divorced from reality. Because if you're going to write about the history of even just the history of peer-to-peer currency, if tally sticks don't even get a mention, you're already missing more than 90% of all monetary history of humanity.
Right. Jose, is tally sticks confirmed?
Yep.
All right. So moving to the Qin, And again, notice how much time we just spent talking about a dynasty that existed for 15 years. Right? That I just want people to grok that. Those are some of the uh ironies of studying history, is like you can't actually underestimate how important the Qin are, even though it existed for such a brief period. And so so we're gonna play our thing. You can see immediately it gets split. Let me just go back just for a second. It gets split, and you can see then the warring factions here. You can see the Han, and then they consolidate themselves. And the Han stretch all the way to Vietnam. So we're looking, remember, it's moving forward here. We're at 120 BC. The Han extend westward, and here we get the Western Han region. So at this point, now we have the largest Chinese empire in their history thus far. And the Han obviously are the largest ethnic group in China. One of the interesting things is when you learn Chinese, you learn Mandarin, which is a further standardization and of the language. But there are 200 different dialects of Chinese. Someone was asking, I was going to show it earlier, but you were riffing too hard that I ended up losing it. But someone was asking, can we get let's see if I can find it. Can we get a GoFundMe for the Chinese to do a alphabet? And the cool thing about the Chinese characters is, one, they are in minor ways hieroglyphic. So they actually are depicting an image. But it was a way to unify all these different dialects. And some of these dialects are like pronouncedly different. And in Chinese, you have tones. This is something that we don't have, especially if you're an English speaker. And if you listen to someone speak Cantonese, or in Mandarin has 4 tones, Cantonese, I believe, has 7. And you could take a word like li. Okay, I'll use Mandarin. So the tones go, one goes up, li. The second one is flat, li. The third one goes down, li. And then the fourth one goes up and down, li. And those are all 4 different words if you hear it. But when you write it, everyone can see it. And so one of the problems is the enunciation of Chinese with their tonal system makes the written script of Chinese very, very useful. And even with an alphabet, it could, I mean, there is pinyin, right? So for me as a Westerner, when I don't read Chinese very often anymore. So if you give me the pinyin, I can correctly pronounce any Chinese character. So that is their sort of phonetic transition of their characters into like an alphabet. Just respond to someone in the chat. Again, guys, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send those in. So now we get to the Han Dynasty, and this is a successful 400-year dynasty. Okay, so what the Han becomes culturally foundational, that the majority of ethnic identity of China is still Han Chinese. And the Han established an enduring model of this imperial political order. So they took the revolution of the Qin and they essentially, like I said, concretized it. And Luoyang, the capital city under the Han, becomes one of the biggest and greatest ancient cities in the world at the time. And it truly is an international commercial center. Because we're talking, this is before the rise of Islam, right? We'll get to the Tang and we'll get to Xi'an, the new capital city, and it also being this massive cultural hub where you could go there and you could see Christians, you could see Buddhists, Taoists, Muslims, Persians, all types of different people. Well, even before that, 400 years before that, 600 years before that, in Han China, you already had this massive intermingling and the establishment of the Silk Road. And I wrote down that it's under the Han Dynasty that the Greeks encounter the Chinese, at least in written history, as the Saras. And that's the Greek word, and it translates as silk. And that the Greek described it the land of silk. That's what they understood in a la the Silk Road. And in Greek, it was just called, it was essentially the Chinese Road. That was an interesting, in the Greek mind, they're calling it the Silk Road, but that's because the term they had for China was the word silk. So that's why we still use the term Silk Road today. It was the Chinese road of commerce. So you get the Western Han, and you get Liu Bang as the founder, and he defeats the rival Xiang Yu at the collapse of the Qin. You get the great Han synthesis then is this Qin style bureaucracy, as we said, the centralization and this bureaucratic mixed with Confucian political morality. Now, they don't go with the Mohists, they go with, I guess you could say, Orthodox Confucianism. And they create a sort of legalist machinery and Confucian justification for that. And it becomes one of the great formulas of Chinese imperial government, really. And you get great emperors like Han Wudi is one of the famous Emperor Wu, famous, one of Chinese most consequential emperors. I don't know if did I keep him in here? Oh, this was something that I wanted to mention. I totally forgot. During the Warring States period, another cool thing, I should have just been clicking through here as we moved. The Battle of Chongping. Most people, I guarantee you, everyone listening to this, majority of people have never even heard of this battle. Guys, we're talking the deadliest battle in human history with roughly, and this is secular modern estimations, of 450,000 people. Just imagine, we're talking, 200 years, 300 years before Christ during this period. And almost 500,000 people die in one battle. Now, it stretched for a long time. It was basically a 2-year period. And it ended in decisive victory for the Qin forces. This is how they took over the Zhao. But imagine that. Almost 500,000 people. Anyways.
And I wanted to point out, too, like, it's not till Napoleon do you get a 1,000,000-man army in Europe. And in that battle, you have, including both sides, 700,000 dead.
It's hard to even grok.
And that is the fruit of the breadbasket plan, the work that the Qin did and laid down to have a population where they could draw those kind of men. Because especially in a peasant economy like that, you essentially need 20 peasants working, or 20 peasants, artisans, etc., working for every one man that you can field as a soldier. So it's so if you have 700,000 dead, then you'd have another 14 million at least of farmers, peasants, artisans, just to supply and keep those men in the field for while they were alive. That's the craziness of the scale. And I did want to point out here, so the part of the reason why the Qin fell was the harshness of the Qin dynasty. Death penalty was for everything. And this played a huge reason in the rise of the Han dynasty, because the Han are both they define the ethnos of China too. Yeah. That's a big thing, but they're also absolutely hilarious in terms of their rise, as well as the contradictions that run throughout this Han family. Because so the founder of the Han dynasty he was a peasant. His name was Liu Bang, eventually Emperor Gaosu. But he's the first and the only founder of a Chinese dynasty who was actually a peasant, and it's absolutely absurd his rise to power. So he was working it's interesting. He was known by his family for avoiding manual labor, not wanting to farm, and besides being lazy, habitually running up drinking tabs that he wouldn't pay for. So he's a bit of a drunkard, an alcoholic, and this comes big part of the story. So he managed to get a job as a minor rural official. He was working as the postal station chief, which besides having to do mail delivery for Pei County. So besides doing delivering mail, which apparently he preferred to do rather than hard labor on a farm, he also had a duty which was functioning as a constable to escort convicts to go work on the stuff that the Qin emperor wanted to have work on, including the terracotta army. So he was in the process of escorting a labor detail, which was loaded full of prisoners. And the punishment, just like with the Roman Empire, for if just one escaped, the punishment would be death. And so he was this specific labor. I think this labor troop was headed towards the Grand Canal, actually, to work on that. Which is the Grand Canal system is what connected all the major rivers on the inside of the Chinese heartland to the sea, which Grand Canal became a huge thing. And then actually it was the Grand Canal's, the amount of people who died working on the Grand Canal ranked in the millions. And that's actually where the grievance by the farmers, the peasantry against the Qing, a lot of the grievance came from that, because many people had family, relatives, etc., who died from that conscripted corvée labor. So he's on the road escorting these convicts, prisoners, to be essentially labored to death in building the Grand Canal. And they were essentially started disappearing one by one. And he did the math himself, and he realized that they were vanishing faster than he could forge the records to not get himself executed. So before reaching Mount Lee, he decided he just stopped the whole train, informed all the convicts while they were at the marsh west of Fengyi. So he told them, "Hey, so I don't want to get executed, and I don't see a point of doing this anymore. So y'all can go free." So he just lets all of them go. And then he proceeds to walk to the closest village that had a bar, sat himself down, and started, of course, drinking, because that's what he does. Essentially, his plan was apparently just to drink himself to death, because he'd rather that than getting executed by however the Qing did execution. But the thing is, several, like more than 10 laborers, I don't know how many, no knows exact many, but several, little more than a dozen showed up for releasing him, releasing them from essentially being worked to death. Grateful to him, essentially stayed with him as he was drinking at that bar. And these men would become the first men who would fight with him, because he came to the conclusion, well, I guess it's better to be an outlaw than drink myself to death. So he became an outlaw formally, with these core 12 men being his first, his first crew, motley crew. He took over an abandoned mountain stronghold at Mangdang, maintained quiet contact with his old friends from his drinking buddies back home, two who were important, Cao Shen and Xiao He. And then those two would eventually become his important lieutenants. So you have this giant uprising that happens against the Xi, the Dazixiang uprising, which broke out in 209 BC. At this time, he was living comfortably as an outlaw, essentially doing whatever he had to do to avoid execution, which is the other irony thing. He wasn't exactly looking to lead people at any point. Even this time as an outlaw, he ends up building his outlaw crew not to become a more successful outlaw, but just to have the numbers so that he could guarantee that the local magistrate couldn't seize him and execute him. So literally everything he does is for the sake of avoiding execution. So this revolt happens, and the magistrate who wanted to execute him decided he wanted to get in on this rebellion because it would benefit him. He invited Liu Bang to come back. So instead of, hey, like, bro, I'm not going to kill you, but just come back and let's do the help us with fighting this revolt. But the magistrate got cold feet and then tried to execute Liu Bang's two friends, Cao Shen and Xiao He, who escaped, alerted Liu Bang to the double cross. And what's interesting is the townspeople underneath the magistrate decided to rise up on their own and kill the magistrate. So Liu Bang ends up walking back into Pei County and finds himself leading an army of 3,000 men at this point. So the magistrate who wanted him to be executed is dead. The emperor who wanted to execute him is currently fighting a rebellion. And his goal at that point was make sure that I don't lose to the emperor so I don't get executed. So things keep spiraling out of control for the poor guy. Essentially over 4 years of the Chu and the Han contention against Xiang Yu, he ends up conquering what is the former Qin territory. And Liu Bang declares the Han dynasty in 202, 200 years ago, after Xiang Yu committed suicide. And so he essentially went from peasant to outlaw to peasant to minor constable trying to avoid farm work, to outlaw to rebel leader, and now to an emperor of China in about 7 years. Entirely because he was driven by one thing and one thing alone, which was don't get executed. Apparently the only way to guarantee one is not going to get executed is to become the emperor of China.
Right.
So this is the
even that doesn't guarantee it.
True, but that was the closest plan. In the end, he managed to avoid execution. And this is where the nuttiest part is, because he was a peasant and not exactly the most literate of men. He had extreme contempt for the origins. Yeah, he had extreme contempt for the Confucian court scholars at the beginning of his reign. So he actually grabbed a scholar's ceremonial hat off of his head, urinated in it in front of the entire court, And when advisors were pressing him on court ritual and protocol, he simply gave them the order, make everything simple. So it was so the crazy thing is the initial rule was very rough, especially with the scholars. But as he progressed in over the years of his emperorship, he accepted that a functioning bureaucracy was quite critical for him staying emperor. So, and he needed educated administrators for that to happen. So the Confucian scholars worked their way back into his government during his reign, and that's how Confucianism ended up becoming this full state orthodoxy of the royal court, of the imperial court. But yeah, so that's how the Han Dynasty formed. A peasant rose from absolutely nothing to becoming emperor because he didn't like doing manual labor and he didn't want to get executed and he just wanted to drink in peace. Right.
So one of the more important emperors of Han, which I was going to. So thanks for taking us back because this is chronological. This is the founder of the Han Dynasty, as Jose just laid out. And the one that I was trying to connect back to was Emperor Wu of Han. So if we go back to our map here and we look at Han reaching its sort of climax and apex, you'll see that it's under Emperor Wu. And this is Emperor Wu, 7th emperor of the Han Dynasty. Reign lasted 54 years, which is considerably long. A record not broken until the reign of Kangxi, emperor more than 1,800 years later, and remains the record for an ethnic Han emperor. His reign resulted in vast expansion, geopolitical influence, and that's what I had written down is for Emperor Wu, imperial expansion, campaigns against these people right here, the Xiongnu. This is a tribal confederation of nomadic people up north. You can look at the map here. So again, in the Mongolian plateau to the north, again, this is one of those features that I mentioned at the opening of the stream of Chinese history is the threat north. And it's a Eurasian steppe people, the precursors to the Hun who wreak havoc in Europe. And Wu ends up defeating them. So the campaigns against the Xiongnu, Wu ends up defeating them. Deeper Central Asian engagement. That's why when you look at the map here, they expand. And this is where, again, why are the Uyghurs where the Uyghurs are? Well, it has to do with history. And for those of you who don't know who the Uyghurs are, actually, Jose and I think we talked about that backstage one day. The Uyghurs are a very unique ethnicity, even in modern day China. You've heard about potentially the concentration camps and stuff like that on the news. Regardless of the veracity of some of those claims, the Uyghurs are a Turkic Muslim, essentially province within modern day China. And they are insular. They maintain their culture. And that's one of the things that it irritates the Han is that they are sort of one of the last cultural holdouts. And it has to do with them being part of this entire history of this mixture between Chinese culture, administrative order, and these Turkic nomadic groups that sort of blend with them. So anyways, Emperor Wu defeats these people, expands the Han Dynasty, strengthens the imperial institutions, and as Jose mentioned, he enhances Confucian influence at the court. It truly is the dogma of the day. And Chinese history is never simply just a story of internal battles. It's always the relationship with the Asian steppe peoples. Sometimes war. In fact, their early interactions with the Xiongnu, they were able to sort of pacify them with, I forget how many thousands of Chinese women they would give them. And so they would give them women, they would give them supplies. But eventually they kept getting closer and closer, violating some of their peace treaties. So there was tribute, there was diplomacy, there was marriage, but ultimately, under the Hans, they responded in total conquest. And this is what allows for the Silk Road. So because the Han expand westward, now you can see, and on another map, you can find what are called some of these Han protectorates or Chinese protectorates, and you'll find them especially during the Tang, where they will have these little territories where they will make sure that travel and commerce can take place through the Silk Road because this was so beneficial for China. So you can see the establishment of the Silk Road beginning here, especially under Emperor Wu. And then you get the famous historian. So I don't know if anybody's heard of this guy right here, but he is if you're going to look at primary historical sources in China, he is sort of the guy. Sima Qian was a Chinese historian during the early Han Dynasty. Is considered the father of Chinese historiography, and a general history of China covering more than 2,000 years from the rise of the legendary Yellow Emperor and formation of the first Chinese polity to the reign of Emperor Wu of Han. So this is what I mentioned earlier when we were getting into when I said once we get into the Han, we'll talk about how the first history of the Chinese people gets written, and it gets written under this man. And that's why it's historically significant. We're talking, a century essentially before Christ. So that is important. That happens during this period. And then Han religion. During this period, of course, you have the imperial heaven worship, right? We still have Tianming, the mandate of heaven, and the understanding of the emperor. We have ancestral rites, imperial ancestral rites. So not just at the cultural local level, we're talking full-blown imperial ancestral rite rituals. Also the rise of local gods. So we talked earlier about during the Shang, how various generals or war heroes would be deified after death. Well, this continues under the Han and gets more explicit, if you will, where there become local gods across China proper. You get these immortality traditions, and this is where you begin to see the rise of the Taoist immortals. Now, they'll take a more important role, especially under the Tang, when we get there. But we see these traditions begin to emerge, the search for immortality, the elixir of life. These are things that the Chinese emperor himself are wanting to attain, and that's what the Taoist monastics are trying to discover. So you get the traditional Chinese cosmology during this Han dynastic period. All the Taoist concepts of yin and yang, this gets developed during this period. The 5 phases. So this was a point I wanted to make regarding the elements, right? So you have the 4 elements in the West, and it's like what? Earth, fire, air, and water. Well, in the Chinese phases, you get earth, water, fire, wood, metal, and you have 5. And they're not understood as static. So this was the point that I wanted to make. It's not, the importance isn't the difference in number. The importance is the difference in concept. In the West viewed these 4 elements as static properties, like getting back to Greek philosophy, and you get into the discussions of what's primary. Is it water? Is it air? Is it fire? This is Heraclitus. This is Anaxagoras. These are people trying to find what the fundamental property of being is. Well, in China, they didn't have that understanding of these static properties. And so all 5 of these were known as phases. And that energy is transferring itself from the earth to fire, to wind, to metal, to wood, to water. And that these are fluid categories. And I bring that up just because we talked about Yu the Great, the foundational emperor, and his diverting of the river system, and that water really is the sort of overarching metaphor for Chinese thought. And you can see that same idea with their 5 phases, which is part of the sort of Taoist metaphysical spiritual heritage. And at this point, you start to get unique Taoist schools. And so the emperor's legitimacy exists within this sophisticated cosmological worldview of Confucius values on how does the self order him in relationship to the whole. And you get these Taoist concepts of spiritual immortality, of heaven, of this metaphysics, of energy. And the emperor's arriving right in the center of all this. Now, during the Han is also when Buddhism begins to arrive. Now, Buddhism doesn't really take root from the get-go. It's very much at the local level, where some foreigners are coming. It's coming in from the West, so around the Himalayas, through the Silk Road. And we'll get into, when we get to the Tang Dynasty, the famous book, The Journey to the West, because I'm going to ask Jose if he's ever read that. But at this point, these are mostly foreigners coming in and setting up shop inside China, bringing Buddhism with them. By the later Han, Buddhist translators were active, and they translated Buddhist texts beginning around the 2nd century AD as their first historical evidence of this. So by the 200s, Buddhism is actually translating Buddhist texts into Chinese in China under the Han Dynasty. Eventually, China will profoundly transform Buddhism. You'll get Pure Land Buddhism, you'll get Chan Buddhism, and these are different flavors. And it's the Chan Buddhism that's going to make its way to Japan, where you'll get Zen Buddhism, the Buddhism that most people are, I guess, aesthetically most familiar with. Well, that's a unique form of Japanese Buddhism that emerges out of Chan Buddhism. So you see the Indian tradition goes around the Himalayas, evolves within these Chinese values of Confucianism and Taoism, and that form of Buddhism makes its way to Japan, where some of the Indian versions mixed with aspects of China is going to make it to Tibet. Or you're going to get Vajrayana, Tantric Buddhism, a totally different form than what emerges in Japan. And so during the turn of the millennia there, so between the years 9 and 23, during the life of Christ, the Han Dynasty is actually briefly interrupted by Wang Meng, and he establishes the Qin Dynasty for a very brief period. Han rule is then reestablished, and you get eventually the Yellow Turban Rebellion. So let me go to my video here, and I'll let it play a little bit. And you'll see this revolution emerge here up in the north. It's called the Yellow Turban Rebellion. It has an important religious component to it because it emerges mostly out of Taoist-inspired healing and a millenarian movement. And this really sets, so here you see Wang Meng with the Qin take over, and then you get this revolution up here in the north. You're going to see the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And anyways, what my point is with it's important religiously speaking is because it sets the precedent within Chinese history to be very suspicious of religious movements. Because, and here it is, the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Did you see that real quick? It's basically a Taoist-inspired millenarian healing spiritual movement. And you can see how quickly that spreads and takes this incredibly powerful Han Dynasty down to its knees. And so religious movements are seen within Chinese historical memory as incredibly politically dangerous, that they can spread like wildfire. And it's not going to be the first time. There's going to be other rebellions as we move through here that are going to have a sort of spiritual undertone to them. So when you look at religion then in modern China and why, so many of the faiths are infiltrated by government workers to keep an eye on things, that's because their historical memory has been suspicious of religious movements, generally speaking. And eventually you get the age of division following the Han. So I'll give it over to Jose to talk about whatever it is he wants to get into regarding the Han.
Yeah, no, one big thing is the invention of paper in about 105 AD. So before the Yellow Turban Rebellion kicks off, that's very significant from a monetary perspective because when you get to the Tang and Song Dynasty, you have the first experiment with paper money and fiat money, as well as with the Yuan Dynasty, as well as had their own too that was fiat based. But the Silk Road had its own funny story of how it started up, or got solidified during this time. So Emperor Wu dispatched Zhang Qian in 138 BC. And he was not sent to open up trade, but to seek a military alliance with the Yuezhi people against the Xiongnu, and the Yuezhi were in Central Asia. The Zhang Qian, however, he was arrested or seized by the Xiongnu in almost immediately, and he was held captive for 10 years. He married a Xiongnu woman, had his children, but he never abandoned his mission. And when he was able to escape after about 10 years, he escaped westward with his companions and his wife and children. So he managed to reach Central Asia and then failed his mission because after he crossed the brutal deserts and the mountain terrain he reached the Yuezhi to find out that they had resettled in the ancient Greek kingdom of Bactria, and they had zero interest in going to fight the Xiongnu. So the alliance he'd been sent to secure never happened, and it's also an interesting intersection there of the Chinese with the Greeks. So that ancient Bactrian kingdom. So on the way, so he decides to go home, and on the way home, of course, he gets captured again, held for a year, and then finally made it back to China in 125 125 BC, about 13 years in the end after he left, with only one other member of the original party surviving the journey.
Wow.
So the journey was a complete and total failure from a political and military standpoint, he brought back the first reliable Han account that he wrote up concerning Central Asia's cities, its kingdoms, its markets, and of course its horses, which the Han court immediately acted on, and they opened formal trade and diplomatic contact westward through what's now Transoxania or Central Asia. So that is essentially the foundation of the Silk Road, being a direct byproduct of a failed military intelligence mission, and it was never really a planned trade initiative. But because of the groundwork, because of the agricultural revolutions laid down by the Qin, you already had a product that the West would want, silk. Already, the industry already built up, and now you had the means set up for that silk to flow westward. And of course, you have in the West, you have in the Roman Republic, you have people complaining. I think Cicero even complained about how Rome was going to go bankrupt because all of its silver was fleeing eastward to buy silk for people's women. So the women folk were going to bankrupt Rome in terms of because all the currency would flee Rome. Interestingly enough, this concern was that was held by some in the Senate was incorrect, because while silk was flowing westward, what Rome had over China was in particular glassware. The glass-making techniques of the Mediterranean were superior to anything that China had. And so the amount of volume of silk moving westward was met with the amount of the volume of glassware moving eastward. So that there was actually a balance of trade between the Roman Empire and the Han Chinese, even though the two never had formal relations with each other.
Interesting.
So, and this is also interesting too. In terms of technology, Zhang Hen invented the first working seismograph. So you have a 6-foot bronze vessel shaped like a wine urn, ringed with 8 dragon heads, one for each compass direction. Each held a small bronze ball in its jaws. So with a matching bronze toad underneath that would with a mouth open to catch it. So inside the central vessel, you had a pendulum that was flanked by lever and catch mechanisms connected to each dragon. So essentially, when distant earthquake seismic waves reached the device, the pendulum would swing towards the direction the wave came from, which triggered the lever mechanism on that side, opening the dragon's jaws, dropping the ball into the toad's mouth, alerting everyone that an earthquake happened in that direction. This was validated in 132, 138, just again before the Yellow Turban Rebellion. So this was built in. It was introduced at court in 132 AD, and everyone was pretty skeptical of it. And then a ball dropped facing west, where there was no tremor whatsoever felt in the capital, and it was assumed by the court just to be a malfunction. But days later, messengers arrived, alerting that a serious earthquake happened 500 miles to the west in the Gansu province. So the modernist seismologists estimated it to be around magnitude 7. So the device worked, it detected and correctly directionalized an earthquake. And this was used by the central government going forward as a means to deploy aid for earthquakes. Now, I didn't tell you how far the earthquake was, but they would know where a major earthquake happened and would immediately work on deploying relief to be sent in that direction. And this, of course, is a part of maintaining the mandate of heaven, because if an earthquake happens, it's the emperor's fault. So if it's the emperor's fault, then the emperor has to have a means to know when an earthquake happens and where it's happening, so he can deploy relief immediately upon it happening. And then in terms of money here, tally sticks were formalized into state, military, and internal tax accounting. So instead of moving the Wu and the Shu coinage around, which because coins build up weight, matched tally pairs were now being used for all the internal transactions and external transactions of the military. So Han military logistics everywhere. Instead of using coinage, they were using tally sticks, as well as tally sticks between the Han military and the central government, as well as between supply depots. These were also used to make sure that goods being supplied between supply depots of the military, when they'd arrive, the tally stick essentially at the other end had to match. If they did not match, then someone had fudged with something. Someone had brought up that question of like, how do you verify a stick? That's how. There's every stock has one foil. If they don't match, someone's done something, and you're going to have a fraud claim or fraud investigation, which back then would be met with death. So that was that's how they kept essentially clean supply chains for their military. And of course, this system didn't require anyone to know how to write or read, for that matter. It's just the numeric values on the sticks. And they started using, for tax collection, instead of just using straight coins, they started using tally sticks as well for local tax collection at the local level. So suddenly, even like your typical farmer, artisan, your currency essentially at this point was all tally sticks. Even for paying your tax obligations, you weren't really using coinage for even your interactions with the government. So again, coins were only really used in like massive land purchases and things like that. Yeah, so this is the essentially the continuation of this peer-to-peer verification system. And it was simply absorbed into the state administrative machinery, and it became part of it. And it's interesting here, coin and tallies were not necessarily rivals at this time. So fiat currency, in this case, a hard coin, they're not really competing with each other. They're just doing different jobs within the same system. What's interesting is, even as the government adopted tally sticks, because of the nature of tally sticks, you can't supplant any random farmers from using tally sticks for keeping a record or keeping a personal ledger between each other if they're trading silk for meat or what have you. So it's very fascinating where the government just adopts the tally stick system, and England would eventually do the same thing in the 19th century, or the late 18th century. But then England adopted them to drive them out and replace all tally sticks transactions that were happening with paper pounds, which they did succeed in. There are a couple attempts in later dynasties, which we'll get to try to drive out the use of tally sticks, but that did not end up happening in the East until Mao Zedong, where essentially the use of tally sticks were punishable by death to get rid of non-government controlled currency, because that's how communists function. The English, of course, being Fabian socialists, and the Americans eliminated the use of tally sticks long before Mao did, but via force. And the way they did that was using essentially making paper money to be super, super easy and convenient to use compared to tally sticks. So that's the anyway. That was the monetary point on the Han Dynasty that I had, and I'm ready to go into the Three Kingdoms period.
All right, let's go to the Three Kingdoms. So, getting back to, where was I? Tally sticks. Here we go. So back to our map here. The Three Kingdoms period begins around 220. So we just saw that. 220. So here you see the Han almost rebound. Then they get smaller and smaller and smaller. Then we see the Three Kingdoms period right here, where you get the Wei, the Han, and the Wu. Important figures include Cao Cao, Liu Bei, Sun Quan. This is where you get the popular romance of the Three Kingdoms. This is the popular memory from a novel that emerges during this period. And you get Guan Yu. One especially fascinating dimension is Guan Yu eventually becomes Guan Di. So Guan Yu right here is a Chinese military general serving under the warlord Liu Bei during the late Eastern Han Dynasty of China. Well, he dies, and they turn him into a god known as Guandi. He becomes a tremendously important deity that is even worshipped still today in China, specifically by soldiers, merchants, police, secret societies, and ordinary families. And the reason why he gets elevated is because, and we already talked about this ancestral tradition, right? Beginning with the Shang, that he represents loyalty, righteousness, protection, and demonstrates essentially how Chinese religion repeatedly transforms historical figures into sacred, almost religious figures. Again, he becomes part of an ancestral cult worship. And this is, I would say, one of the more interesting points during the Three Kingdoms period. That's what I have. The Three Kingdoms period is only a 60-year period, which is longer than the Qin, but it's a 60-year period where they're essentially competing for who's going to rule. And it's going to be the Jin dynasty that's going to emerge after this.
And what I noted with the you already mentioned the big characters that are lionized in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. But one thing I noted here was that throughout the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and the legends around this time, the game of Go appears everywhere. So it's just kind of fascinating how entwined at this point the game of Go had become in Chinese military thought. So it's what do you call it? Yeah, so it's anyway, that's what I had about that too on that period. And it's also fascinating too in the sense of that this is the Chinese equivalent of their Civil War period, the way that they mythologize it.
Yeah.
It's very similar to how the US mythologized its own Civil War, and you have various perspectives on the nature of that war, who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and even perspectives that have fallen out of favor. But even like the perspective of the Civil War from the natives, like characters like Brigadier General Stand Watie, who was the chief of the Cherokee, who was the only non-white general in the American Civil War, and he was a general for the South, which anyway, fascinating Western campaign that usually gets ignored in people's textbooks. But you have the same thing here. The difference is, well, America's Civil War was 4 years. China, of course, being China, it has to be 60.
So let's get into the Jin dynasty then. We'll let this play. Once we get to 2080, you'll see now the North has consolidated under the Jin dynasty. And then we get full-blown Jin dynasty takeover at this point. So this is a period between 266 to 420, generally speaking. By 280, internal civil war and pressure from northern peoples destroys the unity you're now seeing on the map. The court relocates to the south. So this is when we're going to see a movement of northern wealthy mercantile, textile production centers move towards southern China, getting back to what I opened with. So you get the Eastern Jin, the capital is Jiankang, modern-day Nanjing in China. Large numbers of northern elites and commoners begin to migrate south. This is, as I said, enormously consequential. Economic and demographic center of Chinese civilization shifts from the center of north center to essentially the south center towards the Yangtze Basin. And we see a massive increase in population, rice production, commerce, culture. And those are kind of the main things that I had to mention under the Jin. What about you?
Yeah, so what's interesting about the Jin Dynasty was it was a family power play. And, so in the state of Wei, the Sima family seized de facto power. First Sima Yi, then his sons Sima Shi and Sima Zhao.
Yep.
And they were fine with essentially ruling as regents of the puppet emperors until 265. They declare their dynasty. After declaring themselves, they then proceed to absorb the last of the three kingdoms, the Eastern Wu, reunifying China for the first time since the Han's collapse, and closing out, as I mentioned before, the Three Kingdoms era. And what's interesting is the Jin Dynasty didn't last that well. Now they last a decent amount of time, but in terms of what was this about? This is the right. So in terms of the collapse, so Emperor Wu made two decisions that gutted his own dynasty stability almost immediately. So first, he distrusted regional governors. So he disbanded most local military forces after the reunification, concentrated real armed power in the hands of 27 of his family members, whom he made princes, and then essentially trading a coup risk for civil war risk. And then after that, he named his intellectually disabled son, I think that's the safe way to say it on YouTube, Sima Zhang, who is later Emperor Hui, as heir, despite everyone else's concern about less than intellectually capable emperor, which immediately left a power vacuum. And of course, with 27 of his family members now princes, kicking off the War of the Eight Princes. So that's just a great recipe for civil war. So which over 15 years you get betrayal, assassination, shifting alliances. It makes Game of Thrones look tame. The population far larger, on a scale far larger than anything George R. R. Martin ever dreamed of. And the war's result was the shattering of the military in the north. as well as the administrative infrastructure, so that the five barbarians, as they were referred to, were able to walk into the resulting vacuum in the north, and seizing even the old city of Luoyang in 316, and ending the Western Jin outright. So the remnant court, as you mentioned, fled south, reestablished itself in the much reduced Eastern Jin, ruling only the southern half of what was formerly the reunified empire. So the north fractures into a patchwork of non-Han ruled states. So it's just a fascinating tale of why you don't just remove as a rule. It's funny. What's his name? The guy who wrote Discourses on Livy. Medici. No, not Medici. He wrote The Prince. Machiavelli. Thank you. There you go. All right. Yeah, Machiavelli talks about how if you're seizing a government, one should not be quick to eliminate all the infrastructure, all the personnel of said government from the get-go. And so this is essentially what happens when an emperor does that and replaces everyone with blood family, while at the same time appointing an heir who has no capability to rule, essentially just guaranteeing civil war. So anyway, that's what I had written up on that part.
Well, let's play it forward. We're already 2.5 hours in here. And let's get to the 16 kingdoms and the northern and southern dynasties. This is a dynamic period in Chinese history. This is the fall of the Jin dynasty, and you're going to see a total fracturing of roughly between 304 to 589. If I roll it back here, you're going to see all these different northern Chinese sort of mini principalities, if you will, and they're ruled by different groups. And the old Chinese narrative is that this is essentially the barbarian invasion of China. But what you see is a unique ethnogenesis and cultural synthesis, because these Chinese institutions and Chinese society, generally speaking, are absorbed substantially into this inner Asian Turkish influence. And this is also an important point. It's when this fracturing and this jockeying for power occurs that Buddhism really makes a substantial foothold in Chinese culture. So you get major Buddhist monuments during this period, and I didn't bring them up, but have you guys heard of the Yungang Caves? Let me pull that up. So these are again, this is the period between 300 and mid 500, 386 through 354. And it's these caves that are carved right in the side of a mountain in China. A lot of people aren't even aware of these. This is when this happens. And Buddhism begins to, and you can also, have you guys have ever heard of the Longmen Caves? Very similar. That Buddhists began again carving their religious iconography into monuments within China. And so the political fragmentation and migration in post-Han centuries, as we've talked about, expanded contact with Central Asian cultures and communities and transformed Buddhism into very much a Chinese religious tradition. And the Buddhist transformation of China includes the introduction of major ideas that influence Chinese conception about karma, rebirth, samsara, nirvana, monasticism, bodhisattvas, as we'll get into with the Journey of the West, a famous myth about a Chinese bodhisattva, heavens, hells, salvation. But China really changes Buddhism. So Buddhism introduces this stuff to the Chinese mind for the first time. But then China creates Tiantai Buddhism, Huayan Buddhism, Pure Land, Chan, which later becomes Japanese Zen, as I mentioned later. And so China puts its own flavor onto Buddhism. And why does Buddhism become successful during this period? Mostly because of the war and the social instability. It contributed to an opportunity and interest into traditional offering of salvation narratives, cosmic explanation of suffering, monastic communities. You see a rise in monastic communities during this period. the idea of spiritual merit, and afterlife teachings. So it became philosophically sophisticated and influenced the institutions already there and existing within China proper. And you also get Taoism changing during this period. That while Buddhism is getting a foothold into Chinese culture, you see philosophical texts associated with Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi uh, become much more popular. And you see organized Taoist traditions developing priesthoods in response to Buddhism. You see them developing scriptures and rituals, celestial bureaucracies within their mythology, purification rituals, meditation rituals, development of Tai Chi. If anybody's familiar with that, Chinese alchemy gets going during this period. And this is when the Taoist monastics, seeing the Buddhist monastics, Taoist monastics become concentrated on immortality practices, as I mentioned before. And so it's during this period before the Sui dynasty and its brief consolidation before the Tang that Taoism and Buddhism essentially become the Taoism and Buddhism we generally think of in China. So those are some of the important aspects, I would say, at least from a religious historical perspective, of this period regarding the Northern Way, the 16 Kingdoms, and that stuff. So what do you got, Jose? You're muted. Can't hear you.
That was about all I had. You already covered the Buddhism coming in force, so that's. But metallurgy continued to improve. Papermaking, of course, became very common and spread despite all the warfare. Um, yeah, it's fascinating how as the big dogs fight, life for the common people just continued as normal, unless you happen to have a 300,000 man army marching through your fields. Um, it's amazing how during these crazy Civil War times, there are places where if you were just a peasant there the entire time, you never even know that a civil war was happening.
So after this period here, you're going to see the Sui dynasty, and it's very similar to the Qin, make a brief but historically important dynastic period over here in China. So beginning in 581, so you're going to see the Northern Way. They're jockeying. Then once we get here to 581, you're going to see the rise of the Sui dynasty. Now they're going to take over here, and the Sui are historically significant because, like the Qin, it's a transformative period. The Sui established political and governmental foundations inherited by the Tang. The Tang, one of my favorites, this is when Christianity engages China for the first time. I would make the argument this is the greatest Chinese emperor emerges under the Tang dynasty. But the institutional structures created by the Sui they're going to be inherited by the Tang to allow for this golden age in Chinese history. Some of the things that the Sui develop are like the Grand Canal. It's probably the Sui's greatest achievements. It's a canal system connecting the northern political centers to economically increasingly important south, as we said, of this mass migration after the Han Dynasty, and allows enormous quantities of grain, tax revenue, and goods to move northward. Again, better connecting this prosperous south with, in many ways, the political north. So, Buddhism, Sui rulers used Buddhist symbolism and patronage as part of their imperial reunification. So, you see for the first time under the Sui, the utilization of Buddhism tied with the imperial court and imperial reign. Buddhism was, as I said, initially a foreign religion to China, and it now helped legitimize Chinese universal empire. So you can see this blending, um, this porous relationship and connection between Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, that it's hard to delineate where one ends and one begins, especially after the Sui, because Buddhism gets inaugurated into Tianming, this heavenly mandate that the Chinese emperors are believing themselves to occupy. So the Sui eventually fall due to massive labor demands. They had construction projects all over China, and that demanded people to do these projects. Taxation was also another problem. Expensive military campaigns, and politically in Korea. I mean politically, specifically in Korea, they focused military conquests that were very expensive. And all of this eventually led to a rebellion in 618. Right now we're in 585. In 618, there's a political rebellion, and that's when the Tang dynasty, again, this golden age dynasty, replaces the Sui.
In terms of scale, so the Sui had a standing army of north of 600,000 men, and when they did that very expensive Korean campaign, they had an army of more than 1,100,000 that they used for that campaign. So it's they essentially overextended themselves tremendously in terms of the development projects where they essentially it both brought down their dynasty, but also cemented the future of China at the same time. It's specifically the Grand Canal project.
Yeah.
They built it, and then it broke them. So the thing is, when they reunited, they had a logistic mismatch. So the political and military centers of gravity were in the north, with capitals at Chang'an and Luoyang, whereas all their food surplus was in the south, along the Yangtze, and all the rivers in China, they run east-west. They don't run north-south. So you had no reliable north-south transport link. So and the other problem too is famines in one region couldn't be relieved with a surplus in another, because of this. So they needed north-south routes. So Emperor Wen made the initial efforts in the canals projects, the Guangtong Canal, in 584, so 9 years before where we are in this video. So his son escalated the project in 605, linking the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. Those two rivers got united by the systems into a canal network that ended up stretching over 1,700 kilometers. So they connected 5 of the major rivers in total with north-south routes. So engineering, of course, was extremely complicated, and more complicated than anything done in the West at that point. You have to deal with real elevation changes, terrain obstacles that were insane, including cutting through hills using methods mentioned before, although now they had weir dam techniques, which where they could use water for cutting through hills directly. But yeah, so the human cost, you're looking at 5 to 6 million conscripted laborers, which is where you get the animosity towards the dynasty. And with mortality rates in excess of 40%. So that's how you get grievances against the dynasty, even with the canal's completion. So in terms of the payoff, so the Sui collapsed almost immediately because of the backlash of the number of people who died. It's because he also reconstructed the Great Wall, and then of course the 3 catastrophic wars against in Korea, which were essentially pointless. But the irony is this Grand Canal became the backbone of both the Tang and Song prosperity, as well as essentially all the way and prosperity for China and food security for China all the way through until the railroad. It's because that canal system is what enabled, because prior to the canal system, if you had a famine in one portion of the country or one portion of the empire, there really was no guarantee to move surplus food from elsewhere. Now with this canal built, it could prevent future famines. So essentially at the cost of about 2.5 million lives, through this labor project, the Sui dynasty effectively guaranteed that a whole lot of people would not starve to death in the future. So that's one can of course argue over the morality of that, but that was the end implication of that push. The canal that they built destroyed them, but it also assisted China in the future with future population growth and population explosions, as well as redundancy against famine in a way that, for example, India did not have when they were under British rule.
And you can see here on the map that, to Jose's point, you can see how all the rivers go east-west. And it's the Xi River down here that I talked about when I studied in Guangzhou. You can see down here Hong Kong, Macau, been to both those cities. And then you see Shanghai, major city. Well, that's where the Yangtze River is. Then you see Beijing up here. Well, there's where the Yellow River is. So that's part of the problem that Jose was mentioning. And you can see the 3 major cities of China all at the mouth of where these river systems are on the east side. So we had a question for you, Jose, that I must have missed earlier. So I want to ask that. Major shout out to my brother Matt Scroggins. He's probably on the road driving right now. He's a truck driver, and he says, the bit about the aquaculture of those families has convinced me that we've regressed as a civilization. We have to work all the time to become, oh, we have to work all the time and we become unhealthy from shit food only to be killed and replaced by terminators in line in 15 years.
Yeah. And if we make it to Mao intentionally tried to destroy that aquaculture completely, and aquaculture has been having a massive revival under Xi Jinping. And the irony is, those ancient techniques that were used are potentially could be the keys for the West in terms of securing our own food future, growing real food. We'll see if I think the U.S. will do it after the current U.S. imperial system collapses, or the entire ruling class are replaced. And either through repentance or through literal physical replacement, like how the Yuan dynasty replaced the ruling class of China when they conquered. But it's amazing how, especially when I look at China today, like part of the reason why I have such a deep respect for Xi Jinping is because he really has been directing the not just the Politburo, but even the local governments to draw on their 4,000-year-old history to find solutions to the modern problems that they have. And one of those has been aquaculture, aqua polyculture in particular. Now, it's not closed loop the way that it was back then, because the original closed loop was very labor intensive, but they have figured out a way to do aquaculture in a manner that is mechanized, which it doesn't eliminate the total need for fertilizer and herbicide and pesticides, but it does drastically reduce the amount that is needed to be used. And that's their strategy. We'll get there eventually. If we get to the modern day in this stream, we'll get to that strategy that they're doing or implementing with agriculture.
Major appreciation to Detuliosaurus, my brother Austin Detulio, thrown in 5. Guys, if you have any questions or comments regarding anything we're talking about, please send those in, or if you'd like to just support, make sure you go subscribe to Jose's Substack and my Substack. We are on the campaign to reach 1,000 Substack subscribers. Jose's in front of me in that journey. Go subscribe to his Substack. The link is in the video description. So is mine at the very bottom. And I've been creating some new articles from taking live streams and providing research material for people. So that's available over on my Substack totally for free. And as I've been telling you guys for the last few weeks, Jose writes incredible articles over on his Substack on a wide variety of topics. So make sure you go over there and subscribe. And if you're feeling generous, also support our brother through his Buy Me a Coffee link, which I'll share in the live chat right now. And
my wife says thank you ahead of time.
Of course. And if anybody has any questions or want to support our work, you can see that we've prepped considerably for today's stream. Please do so. We greatly appreciate it. Jumbo Playset throws in $2. No comment. Thank you very much, my brother. All right. So, Sway Fall, we talked about the failed conquest of Korea. And now I want to move to an important dynasty, the Tang Dynasty. And we're either going to have to cut it short tonight, or we're going to have to really speed up, because we're already approaching 3 hours here.
Yeah, I'm halfway through my notes at this point.
So here's the rise of the Tang Dynasty. And one of the greatest emperors of all time is right around here. Maybe I don't even have him on our... okay. Anyways, I'll get it pulled up here. So the Tang Dynasty rules from 618 to 907. One of my favorite, I would say one of, it is my favorite of the dynastic periods. If I was obsessed with Chinese history and I wanted to be a Chinese historical scholar, my first research article would probably be something, or my research project and book would probably be something related to the Tang Dynasty. This is at the height of the Silk Trade Road. I mean, let me take two. This is the height of trade on the Silk Road. This is the true emergence of the cosmopolitan imperial China. The Tang should be understood as that, I would argue, is the cosmopolitan imperial China. We're seeing great empires of the medieval period, but arguably, this is one of the greatest empires of the medieval period. Chang'an becomes the capital. That's modern day Xi'an, one of the great cities. It's underappreciated. If you ever make it to China and you're a tourist, go see Xi'an. A lot of people don't go there. They go to the major cities because it's inward. Xi'an is somewhere around here on the map, where Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, it's all on the East Coast. That's where most people go. It's worth the trip. It's a long trip. It took me like a 22-hour train ride to get to Xi'an because you travel by train or bus. You could fly. It's less popular. Train's much more popular in China. So anyways, Xi'an, modern day Xi'an, Chang'an becomes the capital of the new Tang dynasty. And you could go to Xi'an. This is what makes it such a cosmopolitan imperial city and empire, is you could go to Chang'an and see Chinese, Turks, Persians, Indians, Arabs. Well, you would see Church of the East Christians, Japanese, Koreans, all trading, all with religious, specific religious orientations, all across Eurasia. And so Tang imperial expansion, we see into Central Asia. If I let this play, you're going to see the Tang dynasty just begin to expand westward and northward, where you get these protectorates, you see. You can see they make successful inroads into, now we're past it. But at this point right here, you can see these protectorates, and some maps even show them stretch a little bit further to the west. But you see movement towards Korea. You see movement towards the Mongolian plateau and the steppes. You see modern Xinjiang, toward modern Xinjiang. And Buddhism reaches its height during this period. So Chinese Buddhism reaches extraordinary institutional and cultural influence. And one of the interesting things in a book that I've gone over, and I may do another stream on sometime, is this called the Jesus Sutras. Very, very interesting book. The Jesus Sutras talks about the rediscovery in the last 30 years of essentially this unique Taoist Christianity blend. And it begins with this man right here, Alopin. He is a Church of the East missionary. And he, here we go. This is the great emperor of the Tang. Taizong of Tang, the greatest, my opinion, the greatest emperor in Chinese history. Anyways, he is ruling at the time, and we'll get into some of why he's important here. But this man, under the Tang dynasty, he arrives at the court of the greatest Chinese emperor in history, and he's flanked by Byzantine missionaries from Syria. And it's a bunch of Syriac-speaking Christians. Alopin, the leader, is unfortunately part of the Nestorian branch, the Church of the East. But he actually makes positive inroads with Taizong and Emperor Taizong, where he allows the Christians to occupy a unique position outside of Chang'an towards the west. The Christians actually aid the Tang dynasty in defeating and fighting battles against some of their northern threats. And so because of that, he awards them their own pagoda. And that's what the Jesus Sutras are ultimately about, is this thing called the Da Qin Pagoda. Now, Da Qin is the religion of light, essentially. That's the name for Christianity in Chinese. And they called Christianity the religion of light because they appreciated its moral precepts. And when the Christians, the Church of the East, and some of these Byzantine missionaries got there, at that time, Buddhism, as I said, is taking a foothold into China. It already did earlier, but now it's at its zenith. And they're using Chinese slave labor to build their monasteries. This is something most people have never heard. And because of that, the local Chinese people even appreciated Christianity even more, because it was the monks that would do all the construction work for their own pagoda. So they did not use slave labor. And the moral precepts, the theology, it gained this reputation as the religion of light. So this pagoda was recently rediscovered, and inside of it are all these basically iconography. This is called the Tachin Pagoda. This was given to these missionaries from Taizong of Tong um, to represent their faith. And so it's located 2 kilometers to the west of the Luguantai Temple. The pagoda has been claimed as a Church of the East in China from the Tang Dynasty. Again, they claim there's been no conclusive evidence of such a connection. If you read this book, when they rediscovered this this Christian pagoda in China, they went inside, found all the iconography, and then found all these manuscript type text where you see a blending specifically of Taoism with Christianity, not Buddhism, but Taoism, which already makes sense. Again, if anybody's read Christ the Eternal Tao, it makes sense why these Christians encountering China took a fondness to Taoism, and the Taoists took a fondness to Christianity, and they created these sutras that are sort of blending of the two faiths. So that happens during the Tang, all during the height of Buddhism. Buddhist monasteries at this time, again, using slave labor to build, but they're acquiring significant amounts of land, wealth. They have their own libraries, educated clerics, and aristocratic patronage. So Buddhism is becoming a full-blown institution in China at this point. And you get this famous work called The Journey to the West. So here's the Church of the East. It's a Nestorian church. So basically, after Chalcedon, you have 3 groups. You have the Chalcedonian Christians, that'd be Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, eventually Protestantism. You have the Miaphysites, the Oriental Church, and then you have the Nestorians. The difference is the Nestorians believe in 2 persons. The Miaphysites believe in 2 natures and one nature fused, the human nature and divine nature fused, as opposed to 2 natures and one personhood. So those are the Christological differences here that make these 3 splits. And the Church of the East is Nestorian. There's this famous work, oh, there he is, called The Journey to the West. Journey to the West is a Chinese novel. It's arguably the most widely known or the most popular literary work in East Asia, published in the century, but is describing events that took place during the Tang Dynasty, about this bodhisattva that went westward and kind of mimicked the journey of Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu famously just rides on an ass westward. Nobody sees him ever again. And so it's about a bodhisattva who goes, again, Xuanzang, who goes to India and captures the secrets of India in the 7th century. So during the 600-year, the 600s, to collect Buddhist scriptures and come back. And it's a famous book that describes essentially a monkey becoming a bodhisattva. Have you ever read Journey of the West?
I have not, but it's now on the list. I do intend to get all the classics of Eastern literature for my kids, so that's going to happen.
A copy. We had to read it in one of my classes on Chinese history. Yeah, so they have like kids watch cartoons of the monkey. It's like a popular fixture about the Monkey King in Chinese history, and all East Asians know that book and are familiar with it. All kids are kind of grow up with it. So anyways, just throwing that out there, a unique cultural artifact. That book is written in the 16th century, but it's depicting this period right here with all this rise of Buddhism. And other religions at this point in China. So under the Tang, you're getting Zoroastrianism from the Persians. You're getting Manichaeanism, a dualist cult. You're getting the Church of the East. This is where we get the Xi'an Nestorian stele from 781. So about 120 years after this, we have a stele that's written in Chinese characters depicting Christian theology. Now it's Church of the East, but it documents the presence of Christianity in China at that period. So I'm just highlighting how cosmopolitan, again, Chang'an and the Tang Dynasty was. During the Tang Dynasty, we get the rise of poetry. So the most famous is Li Bai and Du Fu. Tang cultural prestige becomes so immense that Tang people remains a historical marker of Chinese identity in some overseas contexts. So, in the point would be like if you were to ask a Chinese person to refer to Chinatown in America, the way that they would articulate it is the area of the Tang people, meaning that they still identify themselves as the descendants of the Tang when you talk about their little enclaves in foreign countries, which is interesting. And so another famous emperor is Wu Zetian, as one of the more extraordinary rulers, and she becomes China's only woman conventionally recognized as reigning. So historically significant for her. Let me bring her up real quick. Now, she was not a fan of Christianity. And so she temporarily replaces the Tang with her own Zhao dynasty. And she persecuted both the Christians and the Taoists in favor of the newfound religion of Buddhism. So Buddhist ideology plays an important role in legitimating her role as the female ruler of China. So you can see these religious conflicts. And it's one of the reasons why I liked the Tang is because they certainly extended a sort of olive branch and appreciated Christianity much more so than Wu Zetian did. And then eventually you get the Lushan Rebellion in 755 through 763. It's really a devastating turning point in Chinese history. And the Tang eventually survive, but afterward, military governors gain autonomy, central authority is weakened, and financial problems begin to grow. And the dynasty really never recovers fully after the Lushan Rebellion. And then you get the great anti-Buddhist persecution by 845. So if we go back to our map here, we're in 664. By 845, Emperor Wuzong attacks Buddhist institutions. So you can see there's an immense spiritual and religious rivalry occurring in China during this period. And the persecution against the Taoists and the Christians, although the Christians are a very minority group at this point. I'm just bringing it up because we are Western Christians. But especially against the Taoists is responded with attacks against the Buddhists. And so they became suspicious of economic ambitions by the Buddhists. So there was economic concerns. There was religious politics at play, foreign accusations that the Buddhists were coming to take over China, and Taoist imperial patronage demanded to be reinstated with the rise of Buddhism. So foreign religious, again, included Christianity, Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism. They're all targeted to some point or another. And so that's kind of the main notes that I had for the Tang Dynasty. It's an incredibly rich period, and their population almost doubled. So at the beginning of the Tang Dynasty, you're looking at 50 million people. By the end of the Tang Dynasty, it's over 80 million.
And this is a good transition as to why that population thing happened. So revolution in agriculture. So Tang, of course, also refers to the common carp, which was the standard carp used in the aquacultural system of the peasantry. So it was banned for use for farming because it is the same name as the dynasty ruling. This resulted in the peasantry domesticating and breeding a bunch of other types of carp. And what they ended up discovering through doing this was based on a breed of carp they developed, they would occupy different levels of the pond. So they wouldn't interfere with each other. And it effectively resulted in the amount of animal protein you could get out of the same 1 acre plot tripling. So 3 times the complete animal protein by using 3 different kinds of carp. You had to have one for the super low level part of the pond, one for the middle, and one for the top. And the amount of food coming in from the silkworms, waste, as well as their skin or their shells they're constantly shedding, was enough to essentially effectively triple the fish production. So that is what resulted in that giant population boom, and that was the biggest, I'd say, the biggest improvement in their aquaculture system. Even when they eventually would get better rice breeds, which we'll get to probably in part 2. But that's if you triple the amount of protein, complete protein available to people, that definitely,
that's going to have a huge impact.
Exactly, and men can get stronger too. You have more protein in the diets in general. The other important parts too. So Go's golden age happens here in the Tang Dynasty, and it spreads to Korea and Japan and becomes the standardized there. Korea, being very Confucian, fully adopts Go as part of its core of its.
You can see parts of southern Korea being occupied by the Tang right here.
Yep. So the other part is gunpowder chemistry begins here too. So the Taoist alchemists that Patrick mentioned before, these they're in their search for the elixir of immortality, they stumble into gunpowder. So there's an irony for you. And they make the earliest fireworks there, including obviously firecrackers.
Yep.
So this is the beginnings of gunpowder in the was it 8th century, even not even that, like 7th century. Yeah. But yeah, so, and also the earliest dated printed text, not the first dated text, but there's a first printed text, but one with a date, a Diamond Sutra woodblock print going back to 868 AD.
Diamond Sutra is a Buddhist text.
Yep.
So to the point then about the rise of Buddhism, you can see how infiltrated it is into Chinese culture that's the first printed dated text.
Yep.
The Sutra.
Then comes the innovation of the fei kuan, which means flying cash, and it's credit certificates. They were the precursor to paper money, so they weren't fiat certificates. Essentially, a merchant travels to sell goods in a distant city. He deposits either be it tally sticks or silver coinage, what have you, with a representative office. So kind of like a banking network, often run by the merchant's home province. So, but yeah, and eventually the government actually started building their own banking system effectively. So, and they receive a paper certificate in kind, indicating the value of their deposit, what they deposited. Once they get to their destination city, they present the certificate to a corresponding avarice, and they get the sum in local cash, local tally sticks, local or government currency in the case of the government. So money itself now was no longer physically traveling. Not even tally sticks were traveling long distance for the merchant houses that use these, but the paper claim on those tally sticks or on silver or what have you traveled. So this was seen as a means of essentially, the reason why this became popular was because it solved the chief problem of if you're hauling heavy bronze coins or silver, that becomes a burden. And it's easier to hide a paper certificate than it is to hide tally sticks. So it became very well used by the merchant class in particular. In terms of rough market share of how the monetary economy of China was functioning at this time, it was this type of cash was only being used for long distance merchant trade. It was not displacing coin for use in which is the medium for taxes with the government, etc. Nor did it really take any market share away from the tally stick, which was again the dominant means of exchange for your local villages, peasants, etc. So it's essentially filling a gap that neither of the two, the heavy coins nor the tally stick, could fill well, and it's definitely the direct conceptual ancestor of paper money. So the An Lushan rebellion, as you as you just described, was also super bloody. And as you mentioned, the population eventually got to 100 million. So the thing is, when the An Lushan rebellion kicked off, China had a population of 53 million. At the end of the Lushan rebellion, China had a population of 17 million. So just as a perspective in terms of how many people died and how much the population collapsed. So, 36 million disappeared in a decade, and that includes people who were born during that time. But yeah, so it's essentially the death toll of the An Lushan rebellion was on the same order as the First World War, which is absolutely insane just to think about how big China was. And this is the 8th century, the misnamed Dark Ages for the West, but it does display how large China was compared to what was Western Europe at the time. It's just absolutely absurd, the scale of how things worked. And the scale of the military, this is where things get interesting. So it shrunk from the prior dynasty had 1 million that they deployed to Korea, more than 1 million. The Tang Dynasty had a standing army of 600,000. But what was unusual, which was not they intentionally did not raise troops to the same level as the Tang did, or the Sui did, because they wanted to last longer, as a not, what do you call it, anger the common people. However, the huge improvement they had with their military, they fielded 700,000 full-time war horses, like war horses bred for war. And the reason why you have 700,000 more than you have troops in the army is because a horseman would, you would have, like, as we described before, for the for lack of a better term, the militarized cowboys of the Tejano, Texas, 300 years ago, they soldados de cuerda, you'd have 6 horses per horseman. The same thing here. So 700,000 war horses would translate into over 100,000 permanent full-time cavalry units. So this is where you have the first development of China adopting light and heavy cavalry in order to contend also with the problem of their neighbors to the north, who of course were all light cavalrymen. Yeah, so that's the Anlushan Rebellion. What's interesting about it too is, so the other part too, in terms of why you had the blowback against Buddhism and Nestorianism. So Anlushan himself, he was Turkic origin. He was and he had become a favorite of the emperor, and rebelled with his essentially rebelled with his frontier armies. So Anlushan himself was assassinated by his son within 2 years of launching the rebellion.
Right.
But then every leader after that was also, many of the leaders after that were also assassinated by their own sons, which is partially what led to the downfall of the rebellion in 763. So yeah, anyway, massive lasting damage. So
that period.
Say again?
This internal conflict. I mean,
yeah,
Tang, there was, I'm blanking on the name. I think Li Shimin was who I'm thinking of, that he was battling with his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
He had 4 brothers, 2 of which were younger than him. He was the oldest. He was the most competent. He was a great warrior in general. But his younger brother was bestowed the title of Crown Prince. And anyways, they knew how competent he was, and they felt so threatened by his competency that they attempted to assassinate him like 3 or 4 times. It wasn't until he just kept defying odds, and the soldiers would get word of these assassination attempts to let him know, that eventually, with his dad's permission, he kills his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And then he becomes the de facto next leader. So this wasn't totally uncommon, right? It's very much Game of Thrones,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we're talking about probably one of, if not the biggest empire at the time.
Yep. And this is the thing to take into account. This is the different distinction between, in terms of autocratic systems, the difference between a strong man and a monarch, or even this case, the concept of the mandate of heaven, the son of heaven. That's the distinction. So behind a strong man, there is no religious backing. Behind the emperor in this case, or a confessional king in the case of the West or of Christendom, you have the church, or or the perception, or the spiritual basis that unites the people, backing the emperor's claim to power. So that's the key distinction between I would say traditional monarchy, traditional imperialism versus strongman rule. And that's, as Anlushan discovered, the problem with being a strongman is, there's nothing inherently sacred about you that you can't just be offed by someone else. Whereas, if you slay the son of heaven, you slay the son of heaven. Like, think of King David with King Saul, where King David had the opportunity to kill King Saul, but he did not, because King Saul was the Lord's anointed. Right. So it's you don't get that sacral nature behind strongman rule or strongman autocracy. But yeah, in terms of lasting damage for that rebellion, the Tang never really fully recovered its centralized strength. And you had military governors, of course, retained outsized power for the rest of the dynasty. Those protectors, as you're showing, themselves grew more powerful as well. And what's interesting here is Tibet managed to form its own empire during this time. So the whole idea of Tibet not being a peaceful nation is totally false. They built their Tibetan empire, and they managed to seize control of the Silk Road at this time. Funding their empire, their Himalayan empire.
They're gonna make a pact with the Turkish nomads up north. This is why even today the Mongols are Tibetan Buddhists.
Yep.
That's going to come into factor later.
Exactly. And this is where the blowback towards Nestorian Christianity, towards Buddhism, was because of the xenophobia that resulted in China as the result of this one Turkic favorite of the emperor launching on a per capita basis. I think this is probably the bloodiest rebellion, or the bloodiest conflict, internal conflict or external conflict, that China has ever experienced. I mean, not even Mao killed as many.
And like you said, 13 to 36 million people in a span of 8 years that were killed by hand-to-hand combat, right? We're
Yeah.
not talking about machine guns and nuclear weapons. We're talking about 36 million people from hand-to-hand combat.
Yep. On a per capita basis, it's like of those living in 754, 2 out of 3 would die in those 8 years, which is just crazy to think about. And then plus some more because you have to take into account natural births during those 8 years being accounted for. So that's the nature of the collapse. It's such a crazy thing to think about. So that's why when people do the whole like make things feel faster, Americans have no idea, the West has no idea like how dark things can truly get in a non-Christian society.
Yeah.
And that's what we're in. We're in a post-Christian society, so things can get exceedingly dark. If the Lindsay Clancy case has not revealed that to the audience, like if that's how your women are, how are the men? That's the
fair enough.
Yeah, it's man, but yeah, I'm good with having this as a break point from if we want to have a part 2 down the line, because we do have a lot to go through. Even though it's just a little over 1,000 more years, there's quite a lot of stuff that happens. So
yeah, we can do that because, like you said, I'm only halfway through the timeline here. Just to show people where we're at, here's the timeline we began on. We are right here. We've spent basically 3 hours providing historical details all the way up to the Tang Dynasty, which puts us roughly around the year 900 right now. So we still have the 5 dynasties, the Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing, and then the Republic, and then you get the communist Maoist takeover. So we could stop here. Wonder what the audience is interested in. Young Old Boy says, this has been so awesome. Well, thank you, man. I appreciate that. I'm glad somebody's appreciated it. XX Lockstep throws in 5, says, Jose, make a YouTube channel if you haven't. 10 to 15 minute segments of your favorite junk to start. History of other. Appreciate you guys. Well, thank you so much, Lockstep.
Yeah, no, I was gonna so Lockstep. So I have a channel set up. In the future, I will be doing simultaneous streaming for any podcast that I'm on. And down the line, if people tip me enough via Buy Me a Coffee, I'm gonna get a decent camera and planning on taking the best of the essays I've written and turn those into video essays. So that's because unfortunately, as I've noted in the past, only about 13% of the American population is sufficiently literate to be able to read even my short essays that I write. So we're very much a visual and audible society now. We're no longer a literate society. Even in terms of functional literacy, only 44% of adults in the United States are functionally literate. And ironically, that'll be one of the articles that I would turn to a video essay first, just about how like people who say like, oh, there's no way I could homeschool my kids. Well, if you can teach your kids to read the sign at a park or a playground and they understand what the rules are, and you don't molest your kids, you are automatically better than the public school system. Like that's how low the bar is for modern education. Even like if you look at the Department of Justice's numbers or the FBI's numbers, the amount of abuse within like sexual abuse within the public school system it's an order of magnitude larger than what was in the Catholic schools. And for that matter, I'll even say it here, like people talk about the 250,000 girls who were violated in Britain and how no one does anything.
Yeah.
The level of abuse in the American public school system is an order of magnitude larger on a per capita basis than what's going on right now in Britain with the Pakistani gangs or the Islamic gangs. And no one does anything. Not only that, you look at property taxes, like your biggest line item for me in taxes is property taxes. A little over half of that tax is going to the public school system. So the idea that Epstein Island is all over there in Washington, like, no, it's literally in your backyard. It's in your school district. And that's where our property taxes are going. Sales taxes too, from the state treasury. So it's just that's people don't realize in America, like it's when you look if people look at Britain and be like, oh man, how is it? We would never put up with that. Yeah, we do. Like I don't see anyone who's going to, clean house in their local public schools.
Right.
That's literally not happening, even though it's worse here.
Right. Dan the Lion throws in 10, says, great job. Thank you very much, Dan the Lion. And Ken throws in 5, says, how compatible is Eastern Orthodoxy to Chinese culture slash philosophy? You guys are very well read about Chinese history. Well, I would just recommend right here, just read Father Hieromonk Damascene on Christ the Eternal Tao, and you'll see that obviously it's not a revelatory spiritual system. Taoism is essentially naturalist philosophy, and it then takes on spiritual overtones in how one relates or lives out that philosophy. I would say there's if and this is the point that essentially Higher Monk Damascene makes. If you were to limit someone's knowledge of God to just a pure observation of nature, he argues that Taoism is one of the closest things you could come to Christianity. Um, because again, for them, they're making the case that the Tao is a naturalistic Eastern interpretation of Logos, Christ, and his order in nature itself. So, um, in regards to aspects of Confucianism, yeah, there's overlap. I mean, we already mentioned one in Confucianism, the idea that one's morality and virtue actually affects the ordering of society, that your personal actions have consequences. This is very Christian, right? We believe that the fall of Byzantine empires and our own emperors and rulers, that God bestowed favor on those that lived a more righteous and orthodox life. That's something that we find in Confucianism well before any contact with Christianity. So there's aspects, absolutely. I think Chinese culture and philosophy is fascinating. It's one of the reasons why I spent so much time studying it. Um, but you do have to realize it isn't Christian, right? So you can't go too far overboard. I've known some people to almost uh, Taoitize Christianity, and the point is to Christianize Taoism. So the movement of trajectory there, you don't want to get too loose with. And I'm not suspecting you can. I'm just pointing that out. I've noticed people do that. So, but yeah, Taoism in particular, I think is very interesting, and there's a lot of overlap along with Confucianism and even aspects of Buddhism, but they're also very different at the same time. I think that's all the super chats. Do you want to try to move forward? I mean, I don't know if we could do a part 2 for members. If you wanted to do that, to make that a members only content for Substack and people like that.
Okay.
We could do that. We could film the rest of it privately. Um, we're at the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, and then the Song dynasty. We could relatively, I know technology sort of emerges under the Song, that you'll probably want to get into aspects of that.
Definitely.
Um, and then, we get into there's a lot to say actually about the Song dynasty. What do you want to do? What's the audience? What do you guys recommend? What's the audience recommend? Because it doesn't seem like, I knew this was going to be a dense topic for a lot of people. It doesn't seem to be the most popular topic anyone's ever engaged with. It does force you to put on your thinking cap. But that's one of the reasons why it's really beneficial to have a historical memory of how all this works. So,
Because I know right now I'm physically and mentally exhausted, and tomorrow is dormition for me because I'm on the old calendar.
okay.
So I'm gonna have to get up early to drive. But yeah, so I'm definitely down to do part 2 in the future. If we want to make it members only, we can, or make it members only for a time. I'm down to do that too.
Okay.
It's but yeah, as you listen, so this is something to consider, guys.
I
Not
knew
hit.
this was going to happen when we said the whole history of China.
Yep, but also we need to be hitting those super chat goals. So that's the other part of it too.
Yeah, I think some of these topics, I think maybe are a little bit more difficult for people, but this is, to me, Chinese history is a fascinating topic that most Westerners don't know about. And Jose and I both have a fondness for Chinese history, and we've talked about it previously outside of live streams, and that's why we thought, well, maybe that'd be interesting for people. So why don't we just plan to record a part 2, a part 2 in the future, and finish up from the Song Dynasty forward to modern China. And we'll leave this here for anybody in the future. who's interested in some of these deep dives. I mean, this is really what you and I provide, and what we like to do, right? It's actually enjoyable to go into depth and not be so superficial on things. So we'll do a part 2, and we'll make that a members thing for our Substacks, and that's a great way to promote our work. So all right, why don't we leave it there? God bless you guys. I may be back tomorrow. Or Jose, is there anything you want to say, brother? What am I doing? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just if people want to see work like this, definitely check out my Substack blog. I go into detail on aquaculture. I do have a couple.
We show people real quick what we got going on.
Yeah, I got a couple of articles on the aquaculture stuff. I actually got one coming out on it about modern aquaculture in China on Monday. I have other articles too on the history, on monetary history. The tally stick, of course, being a huge thing there. Just how the entire, like essentially the Silk Road, as we know it, functioned on the back of tally sticks, which is crazy to think about, especially in today when I hear all the optimists for essentially, well, right now I can understand like Bitcoin's being primarily used by people as a store of value, but in terms of like actual peer-to-peer currency with what's it called, actually used as a means of exchange, we have not had any alternative to fiat in the last 60 years that has come anywhere close to the tally stick, what the tally stick was for almost all of human history.
So I just shared your link over in the live chat. Guys, go subscribe to Jose. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. That's our goal. I subscribe to him. He subscribes to me. And if you search Dr. DPH, I don't think I can find my own stuff. I'll have to go to here. Also,
Stargate Subversion was a good article. It's they talk about all the woke stuff in modern movies, but the thing is, I was rewatching Stargate with my oldest, and all the woke stuff is there. It's just they had much better writing and much better at putting glamour on top of it. That's one of the things about that show in particular. Part of its purpose was for pushing the idea that women could serve as in combat units. That was actually one of that's why Stargate had such a close connection with the U.S. military, the U.S. Air Force in particular. Because that's something the U.S. military has been historically been very good at propaganda. Even today, in the wake of the wokeness of Hollywood, Top Gun Maverick was very well done propaganda. And that's what Top Gun, the original Top Gun, was a recruitment video for the Navy for their flight school, etc. Whereas Stargate was more for an advertisement for the Air Force. The Air Force, of course, wanting to do an advertisement of their own because the Air Force got a bunch of applicants who all listed Top Gun as the reason they were applying to the Air Force. So that's why the Air Force got behind Stargate, because they wanted something that was about the Air Force and not the Navy. So.
Yeah, so go subscribe to Jose, and then while you're over there, go subscribe to me. I'm trying to get to 100, and then we're on the march to 1,000. So I'll show you what I was doing for example, Jose and I's last stream, and I'll do this for this stream as well. Why the cowboy? Well, if you go to the article, I basically broke it down like you do like an academic study guide, not the ones that are for members. That is unique to the Logos Academy, but just a little description of what we were getting into, and then key terms that both Jose and stuff that I wasn't familiar with, but I went back, key terms on the topic, Jose's historical contribution to the stream and what he provided in a very systematic, straightforward way, some of the framework that I provided, and then actual citations to books that we referenced. So I'm going to do this for tons of our streams that we do over here. So if you're interested in having that, that's totally free, by the way, totally free. All you have to do is just go follow on Substack. And, Jose just put this one out today.
Yep.
On what's this one? This is about Owen Benjamin. Yep. On.
It was his. He had 6 critiques of Orthodox praxis, and I found them to be entertaining, but also very American. So I'm like, all right, it's just It was just part of about a month ago. I was re-listening to the Owen Trinity debate, and I was like, okay, there are 9 things here. These are pretty simple, and I just went through those. It was a buddy of mine who actually commented on this article. He said that this clarifies as to where the root of Owen's hostility comes from, which is yeah, it's true. It's something that Owen himself said. He's very much of the American tradition, and when he looks at the American founding fathers, he sees John Adams, who's a Unitarian. He sees Benjamin Franklin, who of course is not in any sense a Christian, and of course you have Thomas Jefferson cutting, like editing his Bible. But yeah, no. Anyway, a lot of friends who are Bears appreciated this series that I did on that, just answering the questions that Owen had. As well as actually tomorrow is the last of the Owen stuff. It's going to be about canonical violations in the modern day, geopolitics, and usury. Specifically, how is it that if people understand, how is it that Constantinople went from initially recognize or condemning the schismatics in Ukraine as schismatics, and then suddenly overnight flipping and recognizing them. I go into detail of the timeline tomorrow, which comes out tomorrow, because that was the one critique of all the critiques that Owen threw out there, and that I just went through the transcripts of. That was the only one that had some substance. But even the problem is he's illiterate, so he doesn't know what he's looking at. But I break down when on the timeline that happened, why it happened. It's a pretty obvious, essentially, what went down and how the State Department got their claws inside. Inside Constantinople. So it's yeah, I will definitely look into Suda in the next few days. Of the articles this week, the one that stands on its own that I do recommend is the case against nationalism. So that would be that was because the thing is, nationalism is an actual ideology. It arises in the Enlightenment. And many people today are seeing nationalism as the answer to globalism, when nationalism was but the first step for the setup of globalism by destroying those vertical identities through time at the local level. And that's something in part two with China I definitely want to cover when we do the part two, how China, despite having all of its centralized power in the center, it was very successful for thousands of years at preserving local folk culture. And part of it is because of how their writing system functioned, where you have one unified writing system across everyone, but everyone still has their dialects. So even like you have multiple families that are large, tens of millions of speakers that are not Mandarin. But even within Mandarin, there's so much variety. I've had friends say the difference between, like, for example, Southwestern Mandarin and Northeastern Mandarin as being the equivalent of like the difference between English and or not English, but like Spanish and French. Where you have some in the case of those two, those are the most extreme difference. But so even less so than that. But if you're going across, like, from the Mandarin family to like the Yue, which Cantonese is a subset of Yue, those are completely unintelligible, but they have the same writing system. So yeah, so that's the interesting thing about China. Chinese traditional Chinese autocracy, centralized power like crazy in the center, but also preserve the local character and flavor of the various folk cultures and local cultures that make up the Chinese Empire.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, so go subscribe to Jose over on Substack. Go subscribe to my Substack as well. And you'll see this stream. I'll create an overview so that, and really they're helpful if you wanted to rewatch this stream and actually learn it. If you read over my overview that I'll put together on it, it's a great rubric to bounce back and forth. So you'll see more of a written timeline there, so you can follow at least this part one version. So do that if you guys are interested. And don't forget, follow me on Substack, but also anyone out there. I have a new membership now to the Logos Academy. It's only $10, and it's access to all the content. Now, you won't be able to join the meetings. The men's meetings are for $35 members only for men, but you can get access to all the study guides, the courses. We just finished the Book of Enoch. We finished the Orthodox Survival course. And my goal here in the next few weeks is to finish my Intro to World Religions course. We got to cover Judaism, Christianity, Islam, new religious movements, and I think I'm just going to throw in Western esoteric tradition, so a very brief overview of the history of magic. And that would conclude theories of religion, native traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, or Buddhism, Shintoism. No, it's Confucianism and Taoism, then Judaism, Christianity, Islam, new religious movements, Western esoteric tradition. So I'm going to have all that done. They'll have study guides with each one, along with ebooks. So both the Book of Enoch overview and the Orthodox Survival course, I'm currently trying to turn those into ebooks. so that you could theoretically read my ebook and know everything that is what Father Seraphim Rose is saying in each chapter, and what's so specific, like what specifically is important and what the takeaway is. So you can then enjoy the intellectual history and already be aware of where he's going and why it's significant. So that's kind of the point of those ebooks. So all that's going to be available as well. So, anyways, that's going to do it for me. I may be back tomorrow with another stream. So God willing, I'll see you guys tomorrow. If not, I have tons of content. We got a sponsored stream. We got a intro to Judaism next week. We got tons of stuff that we'll be doing. And Jose, we got to figure out what we're going to do next week. How about we don't do 4,000 years of history next time?
Exactly. But at least we got through about, 3,000, 2,900. So
Right. And I'm curious if anybody has a suggestion for topics for Jose and I, feel free to throw those out. We're open to anything. And we really don't even have a topic. We just know that we're going to be streaming tomorrow on Thursday, starting at 5:30. We'll just have to figure out a topic. But if anyone has a suggestion or wants us to focus on anything in particular, maybe we focus on nationalism or modernist political ideologies or something like that.
that could be something.
I don't know. Or, we can talk about American history. Jose and I are able to talk just about anything. It's almost the problem of what to get into.
Yep. No, I definitely got more down. But yeah.
History of
So-
Mexico. Well, somebody's gonna have to pay for that one. That's his specialty. You got to pay for that.
We already did the Cowboys, but no, nationalism is essentially industrialism, but applied to people. It is the destruction of local identity for the purposes of making everyone interchangeable cogs, just like the, as we mentioned earlier, interchangeable parts that arose 3,000 years ago in China. You have interchangeable parts when that arises in Europe with industrialization. Nationalism is merely the same thing, the desire to break down the local ties that people have so you can move populations around in a manner that maximizes the industrial power of the state. So that was the rise of nationalism in the West, in the post-schism West. The closest thing to nationalism, the ideology that you can find in Orthodoxy at all, is Tsar Nicholas I's Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. But even in his structure, the organizing principle is the confession of Orthodoxy. The second after that is autocracy, and part of autocracy is patriarchy. Life is arranged around the father. In the words of Tsar Alexander III, the bedrock of a strong state is the strong family. And as he instructed his son, Saint Tsar Nicholas II, you make the family strong in order to make the state strong. What nationalism is an ideology. So nationalism versus patriotism, that's something people asked. So patriotism is essentially a family organized with the father as the one being as being the head and being the one bearing the load of the family. Nationalism is a family that's organized around the children, where the children are the center of the universe. That is the closest analogy that I would find of comparing the two. So yeah, nationalism is essentially what is fractured Spain. Even today, like for example, if you look at the Francoist project, he's tried to force everyone to speak Castellano, and that's part of why you have the animosity of the Catalan toward of the Catalonians versus Madrid, because of the forced destruction, or essentially attempted forced destruction of their local culture. You look at the history of Spain. Spain was always a union of kingdoms. So the king of Spain, the king in Madrid, was the king of Galicia. He's the king of Andalusia. He's the king of Catalan, Aragon, the Basque country, etc. But each would have their own local customs, their own local way, their own local speech, their own local traditions. And when you look at traditional ways of governance, especially in Christendom, but even in China or Japan, local custom was essentially your main central authority that your common people on the ground actually engaged with. So a king like the king of Spain couldn't just overthrow the local custom, of Aragon or of Andalusia, and that's something that people don't realize. Like that's what was stripped away. Like the whole idea of that America was, supposed to be states that were united together for common defense, but could each go their own way, which completely was just thrown out by the time you get to the Civil War, and you have federal troops marching on states who wanted to leave. The reality is that you look at traditional synarchic, monarchical Christian kingdoms, be it Spain, Austria-Hungary, or the Byzantine Empire itself. You see where nationalism just isn't a factor. The idea that it's very much the respect of local customs is a core thing you see in Christian monarchy everywhere, and even in Saint Tsar Nicholas I. I mean, one could argue that. Sorry, Tsar Nicholas I. He's not a saint, but yeah, even in his case, like one can argue the effectiveness of the nationality part of Orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. But even in that structure, nationality is the third leg. The first is very much the confession of the state. And the second after that is essentially autocracy, patriarchy, fatherhood. Those are the prime two marks that you see even in the Byzantine Empire. And one can even see where, in terms of nationality under Tsar Nicholas I, you do see backlash to some elements that try to do forced Russification of groups that was not part of the Tsarist program at all prior. So that's anyway, that's just a brief introduction on that topic. But the thing is, nationalism is a real Enlightenment ideology that popped up in a certain point of time and simply did not exist. It just didn't exist before the Enlightenment. I mean, you didn't find it before France in the 18th century. So and the other thing too is nationalism itself is tied to popular sovereignty. So the idea that the natural borders, the natural unit of a state is of a given nation, which is united by language. And you see this in France, where essentially the language of Ile-de-France, French, gets forced on to everybody. So the Bretonians, the Burgundians, the Occitan. You know, I have friends who are Occitan and Breton, and their hatred for Paris is just sky high through the roof because of the force. Everyone must be like us, and that's the thing about nationalism. It is a homogenizing thing. It homogenizes people groups horizontally. Mm-hmm. What also homogenizes people horizontally? Globalism. Nationalism is but the first step to globalism. It is the destruction of vertical identity through time. One thing people talk about, like, for example, you look at generational identity, you know, boomers, Gen X, Gen Z, or millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. Why is it that you have, why is it that for many people, like the first place where their identity comes from is from their horizontal generation, because that's what nationalism produces. It produces a national popular culture that doesn't persist through time. So you have variations of the popular culture that vary significantly across the generations. Whereas, like, if you were to go to, you know, let's say 8th century Spain, and you go to Galicia, the local identity was much more stable across generations in a way that a national, like, popular culture today is not. Right. So it's a very deep topic to dive into, but that's also the danger of just simply taking a term and just assuming, hey, this is just a thing. Like, you know,
connects with our topic today when we talked about ancestral veneration and how that concept in Chinese history developed through, like, for example, Confucius with this ideal of some type of historic continuity of ritual, ancestral rituals that connect you through time. And that is that vertical connection, as you're talking about, opposed to the horizontal. And there really isn't any deliberate attempt at total continuity, right? Part of it is the demographics have changed. Part of it is the cultural values and the religion, the religious values that underpin the culture aren't there anymore. And so you're right, like the Western person doesn't realize how nationalism itself, and I've been highlighting that, whether it be socialism or capitalism or nationalism or globalism, that all of these are modernist ideologies. And so I can understand the sentiments towards nationalism in the modern day and national sovereignty, but it's still a modernist ideology. It's not Byzantine Empire, Imperium, monarchy. It's not that. It's something different.
And that's the thing too. It's the destruction. Like, nationalism destroys local custom, and it also destroys the confessional nature of states. It's there's no way for it to be divorced from its twin in terms of popular sovereignty. I mean, once you state that the ideal unit of, or rather the ideal unit of organization is the nation, the ideal unit of sovereignty, or where sovereignty derives, is from the nation itself, you no longer have the idea of sovereignty deriving from above, from heaven. So even like the mandate of heaven system, sovereignty is coming from heaven.
Argue, though, I think you could make a case that Mean Mr. Mustache Man was trying to integrate the modernist nationalist ideology with some type of ancestral, racial, ethnic connection to it.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. And
like,
the other thing is
clearly the intentions underneath it, the controversial aspects of the Aryan identity, is a way to sort of mitigate that horizontal dimension that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And there was a program that failed. I mean, frankly, in terms of the idea of what is the traditional nature of the Nazi project. Well, I'll just point out
a civic cult. They don't have a true transcendent religious cult.
Yep. And then, of course, you have people fight over that, the civic cult of what would fall under civic nationalism versus ethno-nationalism.
Yeah.
But you can't get away from the problem that this is an ideological system that requires sovereignty to derive from the people, from the bottom up, not from above, which is very anti-Christian. I mean, literally, it's, even since you, I mean, even take, what's his, St. John of Kronstadt, heaven is a monarchy, hell is a democracy.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, if any reading, I mean, the thing is right now people talk about whatever, but the thing is, like, first question for you, are you literate? Like, have you read on the subject at all? Like, do you know anything of the history of the ideology that you're supposedly, potentially falling for?
Right.
Like, if you don't know the history of that ideology, like, you seriously got to ask yourself, like, do I actually know anything on this topic? Do I actually know what I'm talking about? Do what I think this thing is that what it actually is? That's the fundamental problem. You could say this is partially why I'm a recluse, because it's amazing the idiocracy that we live in, and people are just getting more idiotic. There was actually a post recently on Social Galactic, which is essentially Vox Day's private social network, where someone posted about the number of people with an IQ north of 130, like the total population worldwide, and it's been shrinking since 1990, and it's still shrinking. It's going to collapse. It's collapsing far harder. Like, we're going to have 2050, we'll have fewer people in that IQ range than we had in the year 1900. Despite population growth.
Yeah,
that's the thing. So it's, I mean, and if you want to, I mean, I'm just saying, if you can propose your own ideology of nationalism that's divorced from popular sovereignty, that works internally, you could write a paper on it, and you will be, what do you call it? You could write a book on it too. And that's something that would get published, because that would be a completely new ideology that is completely distinct from the nationalism that's existed since nationalism became a thing. So, yeah.
XX Lockstep throws in 5, says, U.S. Civil War soon, how slavery wasn't the ultimate driving force. Yeah, we could, that's a good topic.
Yep.
Yeah, we mentioned that last time, maybe talking about the Civil War.
I got the geopolitics of it written up, so.
Yeah, that's definitely a topic that we're going to discuss. Sincere Hypocrite throws in 5, says, The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, or Barthes. It's like a postmodern version of Sola Scriptura, but applied to culture and literature. I've never read that book. I mean, Death of the Author is what is referred to as the postmodern turn, because truth is no longer found in the authorship of any one text. It's the interpretive framework. So I don't know if Roland is a postmodernist or this is a critique on postmodernism, but I'll look into it. Thank you very much, Sincere Hypocrite. Appreciate the support. And let me just double check, make sure we don't miss anyone.
Even the argument of, I was going to build on Dr. Crispy with the, it's still a weapon against globalism. That's like saying, well, we should support Zionism because it's a weapon against communism. It's like, I mean, part of it is because we as moderns, we're used to trying to solve everything right now. And the fact is, the reality, the situation that the West as a whole, be it America, be it Hispanidad, be it the Anglophone world as a whole, the problems that exist right now are going to take 10 generations to solve. Like the Reconquista took 7 centuries.
Yeah.
That's the nature of history. Even you look at China, you have the Warring States period, it took centuries to resolve. The 3 kingdoms, and even then, even after it came back together, you have a brutal, essentially, dictatorial like emperor who essentially gets his dynasty overthrown until eventually you have the Tang dynasty that takes over and things bloom again. So real solutions take generations. And the great irony is most, like, the work that needs to be done, it's literally at your local level, like at your own parish, in your own family. If you want to have a strong state that defends your people in the future, listen to Tsar Alexander III and his last words to St. Tsar Nicholas II. The strong family is the foundation of a strong state. So if that's something you want, then you got to focus, if you're a man, you got to focus on leading and growing into being a real leader in your marriage. And then in turn, really leading and being a father to your family. Yep. Like that's the beginning. And then from there, when you have grown that, being a load bearing man within your parish, like that's the future. There's actually a good article that came out this past week. It was concerning how many people actually have grandchildren. Because there was a study done concerning Sweden, how if you look at the population from 1880, like more than 50%, it's like close to 60% don't have any great grandchildren that are alive. They have no living descendants. So if you look at the history of human history, even especially the elite families, of the West, they all go extinct, and they all go extinct within 4 or 5 generations. So when people think about like, well, what is it that me just having raising a couple like 6 children within the Orthodox faith at the local level and being active in my parish life, like how is that going to move the needle? The reality is that if your 6 kids do that and their 6 kids do that, and you assist your children with your grandchildren, and you set up that pattern to happen 6 generations, like your descendants will dominate the place that you actually live in, like the actual real life space that you live in. So that's the thing to take into account. Like it really is about the what do you call it? It really is about the solutions truly are local. It takes generations. It takes time.
All right. Thank you so much, young old boy, for throwing in 5. No comment. God bless you. And that's going to do it for us, guys. Smash that like. Major appreciation to Jose. Go subscribe to a Substack. Go subscribe to mine at Dr. DPH. And I will potentially be back tomorrow with a Logos news stream. And we got tons of content next week. And Jose and I got to figure out what we're going to talk about next Thursday. So we'll both be seeing you guys at 5:30 p.m. Eastern time next Thursday. As always, until then, God bless.